Sì, prova, prova.
You have an agenda or something? Okay. faculty and not the students. Tu usavi altri metodi, diciamo. Scusa, chi è che allora, sei tu che cominci? Ok. E poi... So, we are 16 minutes late. Luca, you want to start? Ophélie is here, and we probably would need, who else? Jamie, Calypso was, not, and Kurt probably. Here, Kurt, okay. So the three of you? Yes. Okay. So let's start with the presentation of the problem-solving groups.
But as an introducer, I simply have to introduce.
You come also.
And I have to introduce Kurt and Ophélie. But before I give the floor to the rapporteurs, I just want to thank all the other participants. It was a very vivid and positive discussion in two times, especially the second, which was benefiting of the view from the terrace of the Pontignano Abbey, and it was really rich. Of course, we did cover only a little part of the ambition of this working group. I think that the proposal is in line with our expectation. That means problem-solving orientation, and I leave the floor to Kurt and Ophélie to explain what we cover. Thanks.
So just, come on. You have more or less 20 minutes presentation and some question. Also for the benefit of the participant to the very last plenary session, we have Mr. Roos, MEP from ECR, Eric Jones, Calypso Nicolaidis, Rosa Martinez, and you will, in the last plenary session, comment on the conclusion of the problem-solving groups and on the concept paper, with John Cooper chairing you. So it's you.
Well, thank you very much, Francesco. Well, we all know, of course, that there's a kind of democratic deficit within the EU, and that less and less people seem to care about democracy in general, which poses, of course, a problem for the institutions, for the representation, and for the decision-making in general. But this is also a problem in the wider perspective, being that if Europe is not, let's say, the shining light anymore worldwide, but if democracy is not working properly, many other countries are seeing democracy not as an attractive model anymore. So, which poses a problem, certainly in Asia and in Africa and the Middle East, where we see that people think, okay, let's look to other models. So what we have been discussing, I think, is trying to at least revive the democracy. And one thing I can say in our working group was that the lack of passion about democracy was not there. On the contrary, I mean, it was a very passionate discussion with several people putting bombs on the table that luckily did not explode. But it was a very passionate, and I think that the conclusions that we have made, that Ophelia will introduce, are showing that there is a way forward, and I think it's a few things are already in place, are being used, but I think we have to move forward very quickly towards a real European democracy. Ophelia, please. I want to add one thing, is that I'm very happy, Francesco, that this year students were involved. I think that the Università di Siena and the European University Institute, it's really an added value to the conference, so I would insist that next year we do exactly the same thing. Thank you. So thank you all the students. Yeah.
Thank you, Kurt, for this introduction to the work that we achieved in the 2 times slots that we were given for this problem-solving group. And thank you to, of course, our chair, Luca Versichelli, for this. So we have a common consensus in the way that we do acknowledge that we are in a crisis of trust when we talk about our currently existing democratic institutions in Europe. In Western societies overall. So what we do when there's conflict, we address it, right? We don't run away from, running away from a conflict, has proven that it's not going to resolve it in any sort of way. We have this situation of conflict, of trust issue. So how do we address it? Is there anyone in the technique who can tell me why the microphone is doing this? The driving force of democracy means giving people choice, chances, and opportunity for change. In our discussion, we had, as Kurt mentioned, very different positions, but we did come to proposals that we want to bring forward to you this morning. So I was also kindly encouraged amongst other young people in the group to be here and to be the rapporteur. I still qualify according to the council rules and council definition of being a youth. Not for long, but I still do. And so as such, I want to introduce to you the first pillar. We have 4 main pillars of our propositions. Our first pillar is about electoral change and representative mechanism. Because when we talk about democracy, in our group we focused on how do we co-define direct democracy and participative democracy. So our first proposition goes in line with the age I was mentioning, because our first proposition is to lower the voting age to 16 years old, which is already being implemented in certain member states in local elections. We propose to implement a 16-year-old voting age in EU elections and overall also any other national and local elections in the member states. That will help to not only engage young voters from an earlier age, but also to foster this feeling of belonging, because it's only when you're a part of it that you can see yourself in it and you can identify with it, and that you learn also about its functioning, and you build participatory habit from an early age. Our second proposition is about having a direct election of either the President of the Commission or of the council in a two-round elections, like the system that we, for instance, have in France, of a two-round election process, which can hopefully also make a feeling for the European population that they have a direct say in their representatives. Our third proposition, which can take different shapes or form in its processes, but is promoting transnational lists to elect a part of the European Parliament. For instance, approximately 5% of the European Parliament. Transnational elections for transnational politics. It's pretty self-explanatory, I think. That way, well, we have also the possibility of progressively going beyond the nation state and promoting the union identity, and going outside of also the limitations of national issues. On our fourth proposition, we have the citizens' councils, also named as citizens' assemblies, popular assemblies. Debates are going on around the terminology, as a way of repairing that trust crisis that I was mentioning earlier between the EU population and its EU democratic institutions. We had the first example of this with the Conference on the Future of Europe that you might have followed or monitored or at least heard of. This was absolutely a very criticizable first exercise of institutionalized citizens' assemblies at European level. That being said, at least it happened. And we can learn from it and we can improve the process from it. But at least it happened, and hopefully this was a first-time exercise, a first edition exercise of what citizens' assemblies or citizens' councils can look like at EU level. Our second pillar is about procedural change, which goes with one simple proposal, which is qualified majority voting. We propose to shift from unanimity vote to qualified majority voting in as many areas as possible. For instance, in the case of a non-consensus in the European Council, it would be a way to proceed to a quicker and more effective decision-making without being blocked or drawing out debates for months and months, so that also the EU can take decisions more quickly and more effectively, especially in times of crisis, such as a health crisis. Our third pillar is about institutional democratic processes. And our first proposal in that is to reinforce the currently existing institutions, especially the parliament, to invest more into our currently existing institutions. Democracy is so far the best system we have found. It's not perfect, but it's the best we have at the moment. Or how do we invest into improving those institutions while also promoting direct participation? How do we make sure that direct democracy goes hand in hand with representative democracy? They don't have to be in opposition. They don't have to be seen as a threat by the elected representatives of our institutions. How does direct democracy can actually support and reinforce our representative institutions? That's what we're after here. Our next proposal in this third pillar is about direct democracy on EU level with a double majority. That means that we would set the threshold at a state when it requires to have both a majority of the EU population voting for a new proposed legislation and a majority of the EU countries being represented to pass anything, double majority. And lastly, our last pillar is about social and educational change, with our very last concrete proposal in it, which is more education overall about citizenship and democracy. Do we want to make it mandatory or not is also something that we have debated amongst our group. And that can include several elements such as school curriculums including EU literacy based on the knowledge of EU institutional architecture, or more knowledge on democracy values, which is very broad, of course, or fostering EU identity amongst our educational system. That's about it. Thank you very much, and I hope that the working group is satisfied with this. And of course, if anyone from the group has something that they want to add, feel free to do so. Thank you.
Yes, anyone have questions or contributions or any thoughts that we're missing?
Or even integration of, from the group?
Yeah.
Yeah, you stay here, Jeffrey.
Speak up now or be silent forever.
Are there questions? Otherwise, I will ask you a question.
Yeah, please.
Huh?
No.
Okay. So
Okay, no, well, it's also, we just started. Experiments. You probably mentioned, Luca mentioned the dimension of experimenting new forms of participation, no? And can you elaborate a little bit on that? How do you see, if you discuss this thing, this experiment shaping the metrics to be used, whether experiments were successful or not, so to scale up?
I think when it comes to experimenting with our democratic processes, realistically speaking, from an operational perspective, what happens is that we usually take examples from local realities first. We base our experience first on how democracy, in this case, but it can apply, of course, to many other areas, is based first and foremost into our regions. We have the Committee of Regions, for instance, already doing, honestly, quite an amazing piece of work on that. And based on those local realities, we can then adapt those to an EU-level implementation. And this is what happened, for instance, again, I'm quoting that example, but it's just one on the conference on the future of Europe. Citizen assemblies have been used at the level of national member states already before. For instance, in Ireland, there were citizen assemblies on abortion rights, which led eventually actually to the legalization of abortion. So that's one concrete example of how we can learn from our local realities.
Question there.
I think that although we didn't have time to elaborate, but the fourth pillar is also very much exposed to experiment. When we discuss about mandatory or non-mandatory, we actually want to leave room for sort of experimenting different kind of involvement. And this doesn't mean simply teaching civic education or having, let's say, study plans or things like that, but even including gamification and experience with the young people, even at the local level, in order to, to try to get an idea of what can be the future identity, future idea of identity.
Actually, my question would be, you're talking about transnational lists. It's really, really even difficult to get people interested in their national lists. Many people don't even know their candidates. So how could you raise the interest of people in these kind of lists? What role, I'm from the media industry, so what role does, for example, the media have in, raising interest? What could the media do?
Thank you for your question. Well, I think the point of interest for the population in the case of transnational lists is that then the campaigning would be based first on the actual ideas of the program of that list. And that would also highlight how an issue raised on the coast of the Black Sea in Romania can be relatable for someone based in Finland, living by the sea as well, and having some common issues. And that's, I think, that's the point of how to make it relatable and personal also for the voters. when we talk about transnational lists, the point of it is to show that we are facing common realities, common issues, and that it's through a transnational approach that we're going to solve it, especially when we talk, for instance, about climate issues.
So we should move away from ideology more to the issues. That's what you're proposing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, on that front, one question that we should also ask ourselves, why attempts of introducing transnational lists have always miserably failed, because we have been talking about transnational lists since 1976, when the European Parliament was established, and the very last attempt, Dominique de Vesa was supposed to be here today, failed just in December. So there has been always one approach, which was like, let's fix a fixed number of MEPs to be elected through a national list, which is a sort of arbitrary sort of top-down approach. You know, another option is to have a citizen to choose. So again, is democratically choose which democratic process and constituency you want to belong to. And you can have a transnational college, a constituency, a national or even local constituency, and you have a citizen for the European election to choose which kind, and these are things that technologies make possible.
Yes, yes, which also goes in the direction of a different point, but I'm thinking about it listening to you, which is not something that we had so much time to discuss, but we should also mention in our proposal, I think, how do we go forward with digital democracy? And I mean, digital democracy is not really an option at this point, it's happening, it's gonna happen. When I see people, young people, whoever young people is, it's for sure like, this is also the future of democracy, this is the future face of democracy. We're going to vote online. That's not an option. It's going to happen. Does the EU want to take the lead and to set an example of how do we practice digital democracy? Well, it's up to them to decide, but I mean, now is the time to decide.
Yeah, and, just as an integration, Estonia is an experiment, you know? Estonia is a European Union country. They have institutionalized electronic voting, and the metrics that they use for evaluating that kind of experiment was, is there a age, age divide in terms of uptake of the technology? And it's 30% across different age groups, both elderly and young people. You know, 30% of them use electronic vote to vote. So that is an experiment.
Yeah, I mean, we have that also with access to public services already. When we talk about tax, health, we already have a lot of our public services that are actually taking place more online. So voting is just another one of them.
Other question? Eric. We have one microphone here, so. No, there is another one, sorry.
Grazie mille. Yeah, Eric Jones, I'm sorry, I only showed up last night, so I haven't heard any of your deliberations, and I'm just curious. The proposals that you make in terms of political institutional reform, I think, are very interesting and potentially very important. But when we study disaffection with democracy, we rarely start with institutions as the causal variable, right? So we almost never say that people are disaffected with democracy because of where the voting age is or how the people are elected or whether they get to participate. We usually start by saying people are disaffected with democracy because their income situation is inequitable, because their employment opportunities are unavailable, because they're left behind by a political process. And so I guess if we're going to make the assumption that by changing political institutions we're going to improve these economic outcomes, what evidence do we have to suggest that? Because what would happen if we change the political institutions and don't change the economic outcomes? Are we sure people are going to become more pleased with democracy? And the reason that I ask that question is because when they move from the two-tiered electoral system that you mentioned in France in 1984 to a proportional system, the result was not greater affection for democracy, it was actually the resurgence of the National Front in 1986. So I guess I'm curious if we won't get unintended consequences from the kind of reforms that you recommend.
Thank you for your question. It's a very interesting and a very large debate. So, but I tend not to agree with the analysis that let's say that some people are left behind, and if they vote, you have different results. And the reason is, if you look to all countries where voting is mandatory, and you look for example, to the the Human Development Index, there is no correlation whatsoever between countries that vote with 90 or 95% or those who vote with 50%. Actually, the policies are not very different. I know the theory, but I think it's debatable. By the way, on every single point of our discussion, we could have discussed at least 20 weeks. So we had to squeeze it in 2 times an hour. So, and yeah, everybody feels like we want to go further on this point. So, but go ahead, please.
No. My point is exactly in line with what you say. If we don't believe that there's any connection between political institution design and socioeconomic outcome, then if socioeconomic outcome is what's determining affection or disaffection with democracy, why would we change political institutions in order to improve affection for democracy? Because affection for democracy is being determined by these socioeconomic variables that are completely separate from political institutional design.
It's about much more than economics. It's about democracy itself. So if people don't feel that the way it is constructed now is actually, they don't feel represented by it, then there's a problem in the system itself. So therefore, the system needs to be changed. So if this will have effects on many levels, of course, so but not just on the socioeconomic level.
Yeah, but the two are related a lot. It's, I mean, we need to go to the group on sustainable finance, but it is sort of not enough acknowledge that liberal democracy won in the 20th century because it was more efficient than Nazism, fascism, and then Soviet communism. It was more efficient, you know, was more productive. I mean, the numbers say that it was, and it was so it was not just about values. It was that it was more capable to deliver. Now the things are changing a lot, and so we need to but the two plans are related in a way which is not, as I agree with you, not completely clear. Wow, I think we opened a Pandora box here. Very quick, because of course, you know, we have to go to the sustainable and then group. Sorry.
I honestly think, and we have seen this in the working group. There's so much passion. It's going to explode again, and we will discuss for hours about it. So.
Just a very quick remark from the working group. At a certain extent, it's like what we put in the end was actually the base on which we tried to build all the proposals. So the issue of education, information, dissemination of knowledge about institutions is what we tried to put at the very bottom of all the proposals we built. So this is just to...
Okay, Simone and Victor and the group. Thank you so much.
as an introducer, I just introduce, just to say that we had a lively discussion. It was a very productive one. I was particularly happy of the mixture of the group because it was not a scholarly debate, but it was really with contributions from practitioners, from journalists, from filmmaker, Annalisa, I mean, and the students that really bring fresh ideas on board, fresher than I am. So I let to Victor, who did a great job in managing to keep up on track.
Good morning, everybody. I just want to remind you of the topic because it's not totally simple. The mission we were given was to come up with proposals dealing with the advantages and disadvantages of being the forerunners, that's essentially of Europe, the EU being the forerunners in sustainable finance. How can ESG and carbon mitigation be more efficient and effective? So it was quite a specific brief that we had. And as Simone said, we had some really kind of good discussions, and we realized that we could have gone on for a week. And we were trying to do something that the European Commission would take 1,000 people and several years to produce. And we obviously didn't want to duplicate the work of the Commission, but we wanted to come up with some sort of fairly simple proposal. I mean, the first thing, the first thing I think to emphasize is just the absolute urgency of climate mitigation measures, as well as an increasing and very justified concern about biodiversity loss. We really are at 1 minute to midnight. So our starting point was that the EU is absolutely right to be in the forefront of the climate measures that are being taken. Above all, of carbon pricing, because I think we broadly agreed that the kind of economic motive was what was going to persuade companies and indeed individuals to come on board with these kind of measures. And as with regulating the digital world, which we know the EU has also been in the forefront of, there are advantages and disadvantages to being a first mover on this issue, especially when the US and China and India and other big economies are not necessarily on board. So yeah, we developed our 5 proposals for keeping Europe and hopefully the rest of the world on the right track. Some of them are purely practical. Others essentially about the kind of information war, trying to make this politically acceptable and implementable, both in Europe and increasingly around the world. I want to pay tribute to the students and postgrads who helped us. I mean, really did all the hard work here, led by Mira, who's going to give you a little more detail on the 5 proposals that we came up with. So I really want to thank them because they not only prepared a kind of basic document beforehand to put the whole thing in context, but they were very active in reporting what we discussed, which was a very disorganized debate, inevitably, because it was very short and very rushed, and then putting it together into a coherent document. So I'll let Mira.
Mira,
thank you.
Hi, good morning, and thank you to Victor for that really nice introduction and for actually all of the hard work that Victor put in, because this really was working together with all the experts, the chair, and the students with putting together this document, and it was really nice. I'd really like to echo what Simone said at the beginning. We were really lucky in our group to have a massive variety of actors, and I think this really is what negotiations and policy making and decisions about these topics should be. We had people from banking, we had people from zoology, we had people from policy making in the Commission, and economists, and especially on the environmental side from different contexts. So, as Victor said, we had 5 main proposals, and we really tried to tackle a whole series of audiences in what we worked with. Firstly, at a very broad level, we really needed to think about this tension that we have between talking about a highly systemic issue and something that's very difficult to implement on a practical level on an everyday basis. So all along, throughout the plenary and throughout the working groups, we were talking about these connections between climate change, biodiversity, finance, social justice. This is not an issue that you can reduce down simply to carbon. And at the same time, at the end of the day, when you have physical actors who need to implement these regulations, are stuck doing reporting every day, are stuck figuring out who it is that they have to speak to and what they're responsible for, it has to be simplified and tangible. So at the narrative level, we wanted to connect ESG regulations with the SDGs. This is our broad umbrella that says, altogether, we are working towards a general direction. It doesn't mean we're conflating a series of regulations. It doesn't mean we're making life more complicated by connecting small and medium enterprises work to SDGs on good institutions. But together, we're working towards a general direction at a global level. At the practical level, we separate those two things. So we say ESG remains ESG. But ESG is also something that's itself quite a complex network of ideas. We have environmental, social, and governance responsibilities. And at the end of the day, we're a group discussing climate. So while we know that ESG regulations have to stay as they are, because there's an importance of this institution, a single department at the European Commission that asks for and controls this data and tackles each of these pillars as equals, we do know that going forward, we need more mechanisms that focus specifically on environmental regulations. And within that, we'd like to see a lot more emphasis on Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are emissions that are not coming from assets immediately owned by a company. That means it's a lot harder to account for them and recognize where they're coming from and who's taking responsibility for them. And those are things that start slipping through the cracks. At the next level, when it comes to small and medium enterprises, and they have to account for their emissions, there has to be a simplification for them. So by 2026, all listed small and medium enterprises are going to have to declare their emissions in their ESG declarations. This means that by the time that comes into force, there have to be standard templates and standard sets of emissions records and criteria that make it easy and accessible and feasible, and not a cloud of regulations and paperwork that a small company has to go through. When it comes to making their declarations, that declaration is often getting repeated multiple times because different financial institutions ask for similar information at different points in time. That means a burden of time and energy and care on the part of the banks, but also on the part of the small and medium enterprises that have to provide that information again and again. So already in European regulations, in the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive and in a directive on digitalization in 2020, there are provisions coming into place for a common platform that says that all of this public corporate data has to be put in an accessible and comparable way so that banks and small and medium enterprises can access this and use it and save that time and energy. Once that data is in place and banks can use that data, they play a very key role in being this mediator between the idea of what is important to invest in and what is really worth that investment. So banks have the opportunity to say, we would like to invest in green companies or in green actions, and we put a priority on giving those loans and giving a priority to that attention, giving that attention a priority to these actors that comply with these regulations. When it comes, however, to consumers, consumers need an incentive to comply. There's a massive gap between the need to raise these revenues from these mechanisms and the recognition on the part of consumers as to why they really should pay into them. When it comes to other taxing mechanisms, you pay your taxes and you get that rebate immediately in some form that is quite tangible. You use a road that's being maintained, you go to public school, you go to public health care. When it comes to the environment, we recognize that there's a certain detachment between what you pay for and what you immediately feel like you receive. So we discussed ideas of giving flat rebates, but the problem with a flat rebate is you're essentially counteracting the cost that you've spent to even collect that tax money, and also setting a precedent for something that's not the case in other tax collections. We also recognize that in a lot of different contexts, citizens actually prefer having that money go to environmental reasons. So they don't necessarily want to get that money back immediately. They care about it being used for something that's going to support the environment and climate change, which is why they paid the tax in the first place. People do, however, care about some element of social justice. We know that there's energy poverty. We know that there are different households and regions that are experiencing these changes quite differently. So we proposed bringing the two together, i.e., using these revenues for environmental reasons, but environmental reasons that are scaled according to household needs. For example, if you wanted to improve insulation for households, you'd improve it for poorer households first. We then went on to thinking about consumers who may not fall into that bracket. So you have poorer households who might experience some of this gain coming back, but there's a whole swathe of the population that would actually push back, saying that you've got poor households receiving this benefit, and we're the middle class, and where are we being taken care of? And that's where we looked at examples, for example, in California, where you have the entire bus system, Simona gave us this example, the entire bus system that's being financed by carbon taxes and carbon revenues. And that is advertised on the buses to show citizens that this is where your money's going, and this is where it's a collective good. If we're thinking about dividends, shareholders, the commons, it's a general idea that we are collectively sharing this cost and collectively deriving the benefit. And lastly, even quite tokenistically, we said there really must be communication with all levels of the population to say this is where we are working together with this money that's coming from your loans, from your ESG declarations, from your carbon taxes, and from different mechanisms that we're putting in place for this progress. Lastly, if all of this is put in place, consumers should have a better idea as to why they're actually investing in these items. So a company that goes about with very strong ESG declarations does not have conclusive evidence as to whether they really are going to get a better financial outcome. They need to be convinced that by being more environmentally and socially responsible, consumers are actually going to buy more into what they do. In order for consumers to do that, there needs to be much more education for them as to what this means. So we highlighted that a lot of consumers don't know the distinction between a natural product and an actually environmentally friendly or carbon neutral product. And if a product says it's carbon neutral, consumers don't know, is it really carbon neutral or is it being set up by offsets, which is a whole separate discussion, but we were discussing how offsets are not really carbon reductions and mitigations. This means we need a massive emphasis on data literacy for people to really understand what this information means, and environmental literacy to really understand where we need to go. If that happens, firms have the conviction that by being more responsible, by participating in their ESG declarations, they should get better loans from banks, or even get a loan from a bank in the first place, and they should get better buy-in from their consumers. And that brings us all the way back full circle to the narrative we were talking about at the beginning. Everybody should know that we're working in the same direction towards this progress at a global level.
Very good presentation. By the way, let's try to put this presentation together in some paper. It is called the Pontignano paper. Okay, fantastic. Also because here we have we have people from the Financial Times, from the Economist, from the Times, from the Telegraph, from Il Messaggero, and so that they can help us to convey the logos, the proposal. A question?
It's an excellent question, and thank you, because it was actually in our proposal, and I forgot to mention it.
Maybe you should repeat the question, because I guess in the end of the room, people probably didn't understand.
Yeah, and we have the microphone there.
It was about social justice and like what to make sure that people don't feel that they pay, like poorer people pay most. That's what you said, that we don't get like another yellow vest movement.
And asking whether there's a mechanism for this, and there is a mechanism for it. So part of our proposal was to endorse this mechanism and deepen it, and it's called the Social Climate Fund. And the Social Climate Fund uses a percentage, I think it's currently about 25%, a percentage of revenues that come from the ETS2. So that's the second emissions trading system. And the second emissions trading system covers road transport and building heating. So precisely that part of the population that should be experiencing higher costs as a result of this transition, because they either have less efficient homes or they live in the countryside and they have to drive to work. Households that will experience that marginal rise in the cost of fuel at a greater level. So the Social Climate Fund takes those revenues, and those revenues are dedicated specifically to lower income households to support that transition. The trouble when it comes to communication is actually, and this was quite a narrow research, but still, almost nobody outside of European institutions is talking about that fund. So we have institutional actors who know about it and are promoting it and talking about it amongst themselves. But the fact is that on the ground, people don't know necessarily that there's actually a mechanism being put in place to try and redress this social balance. Whereas people do know that their fuel prices are rising, and they do know that their heating prices are rising. So that's when it comes to communication, we really needed something that goes further as well to say we need mechanisms, we want to strengthen the mechanisms and deepen them, and make them known and actually bought into so that there's an incentive for them to keep going. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, I mean, I think just add to that excellent explanation. I mean, broadly, there are two constituencies that Europe needs to please, and the first and probably the most important one is Europeans themselves. And there is an enormous sort of communication battle that obviously didn't work when the yellow vests in France started protesting about carbon prices, which were putting up the price of fuel. Even though they wouldn't describe themselves as anti-environmentalists, they were directly affected in their pockets, and and so there's a big sort of communication battle, and that constituency is probably not sufficiently served, or it's not explained sufficiently to people in Europe. So there is a kind of propaganda battle, if you like, that needs to be waged. Education propaganda, information, call it what you will. The idea is that people need to understand and actually, that there are benefits to this, and they need to be given those benefits and shown those benefits directly, including through the social fund. There's another constituency, which is a totally different constituency, which Europe also needs to account for, which is the rest of the world. The rest of the world needs to be persuaded that what Europe is doing is not protectionist or unfair competition. And that's a very different constituency and a very difficult constituency to address. But our measures hopefully do a bit of both, talking to both those groups of people who need to be brought on board with the European project.
I just add a little comment. There are also mechanisms of compensation within Europe, across countries, within the ETS, for instance, the Modernization Fund, Innovation Fund, that go mainly to the countries that lag behind. And again, there is a lack of communication. This is something that we have tried to communicate to the Commission, saying, look, people don't know, and people are skeptical even because this hasn't been communicated properly. So there are various levels of compensation mechanisms, but generally these are still unknown. Yes, please.
This also might tie into what our colleagues were saying from the Democracy Group, because the mechanisms that Simone was mentioning with the Just Transition Fund are specifically for regions that are struggling or that we know are very fossil fuel dependent or very industry dependent. And as Ophelia was saying, there are commonalities between regions that might not realize that they actually have them. So at the level of transnational politics, there might be a sense of opposition or resistance without regions realizing that there are mechanisms that are covering different areas that are geographically different but experiencing the same transition difficulties. And that might actually feed also into the democracy channel.
Okay. Let me underline that one thing. There is a very strong link between sustainable conclusion here and the digital. For instance, where there are links among all problem-solving groups. Because here, as we sort of said many times, if we want data, we will need technologies to monitor things so that banks and companies do not go nuts after ESG. So to have regulation, digital regulation that make easier to have that sort of monitoring of real phenomena would be a great push also for having new tech companies specialized into tracking waste and everything.
And at the same time, as it was said during the plenary on biodiversity and climate change, we also need to adapt the new technologies to the developing countries. So trying to figure out, imagine, have a vision of how to adapt things in the future.
Whereas developing, there is probably to be defined what a developing country is, but India is far ahead. Europe leaving alone Italy in doing biometric and stuff. So it's like way ahead. So, but having said that, let's go to the next problem-solving group. Which is Alexandra.
Yeah, exactly. That's about the new financial crisis, and the chair was John Hooper and introduction
Matteo
was by
probably.
John.
So if you want to also join us, I don't know if there are others from the groups. After Credit Suisse.
Actually, this is a slightly, this is a unique situation, because having been the chairman of this group, I'm also my own introducer, and I'm standing in for the rapporteur.
Okay.
Let me just start by saying that our Working Group 3 brought to the surface considerable, some might say, irreconcilable differences.
Okay.
As one of the participants shrewdly observed, on the one hand you had the Keynesians and neo-Keynesians, and on the other you had the Austrians. The result of that was to deliver the initiative into the hands of the organizers of the conference, who have a legendary capacity for getting around any form of difficulty, and in this case did so by the simple expedient of making the rapporteur an Austrian. I actually only noticed one. So what follows may strike some of you who were in Group 3 as not entirely a balanced representation of the majority view. The text that has been prepared with the diligence and objectivity of Matteo here, I will read out, and then afterwards you can put questions, but probably better in the circumstances to make them comments. In 2009, introducing his proposal for a regulatory framework for financial stability, Barack Obama declared that history cannot be allowed to repeat itself. 15 years later, it looked very much as if history was about to contradict him. The first 3 months of 2023 have seen the failures of the Silicon Valley and Signature banks, two of the 3 largest bank collapses in US history. But even they would have been dwarfed in scale if Credit Suisse, one of the 30 lenders that the Financial Stability Board considers globally systemic, capable of rattling the entire system, had not been rescued by UBS. Paradoxically, the latest crisis hit, on the one hand, the bank of those internet companies that are crafting the future in Silicon Valley, and on the other hand, one of the oldest financial institutions, and ironically, one that was at the heart of a country regarded as a financial safe haven. The European Union, this is the good news, seems to have dodged this new tsunami, our first conclusion, notwithstanding the rumors regarding Deutsche Bank and an across-the-board fall in the valuations of EU bank shares. Hopefully, this is due to the stringent regulation that the European Banking Union has promoted. Yet the question arises of whether it's enough. Are our regulations able to guarantee enough stability to both banks and indebted governments and growth to an economy, the European economy, that's suffering from a long-standing innovation deficit. In the last 20 years, the most significant financial crisis in the European Union has had more to do with sovereign debt than with the banks. But the last few months have shown clearly how the fates of governments and banks are deeply entwined. Banks have often been vital to states buying government bonds to ease their borrowing difficulties. Similarly, it was thanks to states intervening to take over the balance sheets of collapsing financial institutions that contagion was stopped from spreading. Yet we find ourselves in a situation in which the stability of banks in the so-called frugal states is under scrutiny, while some of the allegedly prodigal states are coping with the difficulties. The interaction between debt and commercial bank stability is not straightforward, especially in the context of demographic decline. We face the threat of multiple tensions which interact and generate a degree of complexity that may outstrip the effectiveness of the tools that economists have used in recent decades. As Mario Draghi once said, we are navigating uncharted waters. Evidence of this is that central banks seem to have lost part of their capacity to tame inflation, which is their principal mandate, by either altering the money supply and or changing interest rates, tools that have perhaps been blunted by globalization and technological change. For the euro area and the EU, it is time to redesign the triangle made up of the three main instruments with which economic policy is realized. The Stability and Growth Pact, which was suspended because of COVID-19 and will be rewritten before being reactivated. We didn't spend much time on that because that is under discussion in the Commission. The European Central Bank, number 2, which has saved the euro at least twice with the quantitative easing in 2015 and the pandemic emergency purchase program in 2020. And finally, the third element in the triangle, some form of common fiscal capacity that the EU may need to respond to new emergencies or to invest in what Marco Butti and Marcello Messori have identified as European public goods. Examples might be macroeconomic stability, innovation, education, and ecological services. Mario Draghi has acknowledged that monetary policy has profound limitations when it comes to maintaining price stability. So cooperation between the monetary and the fiscal sides becomes necessary for guaranteeing effective macroeconomic support. But the lesson of Credit Suisse is that despite best efforts, the world's most advanced stabilization mechanism once again failed. What is more, the banks that failed in Europe and the US failed at just the moment when capital was needed to support economies after 3 years of hugely destabilizing events, a global pandemic, a surge in inflation, and a war that has caused supply chain disruptions that affect all aspects of those economies. Producers and consumers, creditors and debtors, taxpayers and policymakers are experiencing a paradigmatic shift. Draghi's uncharted waters are full of risks, but they also offer opportunities for a sustainable, productive, and financially stable future. Now we come to the good news. Working Group 3 found that reframing the complexities we are facing allows us to find the solutions we need to navigate the seas of future uncertainty. Clarification is needed here. The bank failures in the US and in Switzerland were external to the EU banking system, which is more solid now than it was in 2008, the group agreed. despite 3 years of continuous crisis since 2020. That said, a return to normal monetary policies is of the utmost importance if we are to prevent a crisis in future. The latest crises were not unexpected. Most authorities and institutional investors had some inkling of a forthcoming financial crisis. But the bank failures, inflation, and even some of the supply chain disruptions all proved unavoidable in a context in which unconventional monetary policies were being pursued. The working group pondered the possibility of a more complex and unpredictable type of banking crisis and its effects on the EU's ambitions for the future. The following issues were thought crucial to a reframing of the status quo. First, in the context of the Stability and Growth Pact, whether it's a weapon for fighting the last crisis, the last war. Again, as I say, not too much time was spent on that, given that the proposals are still being worked on by the Commission. But with regard to the ECB, the question that was discussed was whether what role should it have in the financial market in the current market conditions? Has leverage, for example, gone too far? And finally, on common fiscal capacity, the discussion centered on the concept of European public goods, mentioned earlier, of which innovation was seen to be one. One suggestion was that in trying to resolve these questions, a so-called Monnet test should be applied to see if a proposed solution is compatible with the political climate of the time. A Monnet compatibility test assesses whether a given policy reaction to a shock meets the criteria of economic adequacy, institutional consistency, and political consensus. Inflation surged at a time when fiscal policy was supportive of the post-pandemic recovery plan. That spurred a revisionist outcry, a demand that the ECB limit itself in future to ensuring just price stability. The interaction between the Commission and monetary policy is still a subject of debate among EU nations. The working group agreed that financial stability was a paramount objective of financial institutions over other objectives. The independence of central banks cannot be tied to policy objectives, no matter the relevance. Financial stability is a safeguard for investors and savers alike, often one and the same thing. In our discussion, the word equity took on many forms. Equity is a chameleon. It can mean the need to keep financial performances competitive. It can mean keeping equal the treatment of two or more groups of people, such as our generation and future ones. The working group agreed that the use of instruments must provide for both forms of equity. Sustainable growth must improve competitiveness, and productivity growth must not hinder the welfare of future generations. In this context, the use of common debt is relevant and topical. Common fiscal capacity can leverage resources to support common public goods and safeguard the construction of the sustainable future that we seek for ourselves and for future generations. However, two caveats emerged in the discussion. One is the correct use of debt. Ricardo and Barro noted that current debt is future taxes. Thus, we need to achieve our objectives of economic productivity, sustainable welfare, and financial good performance without burdening our children. Otherwise, we fail the Monnet test and the ethical need for intergenerational equity. The working group agreed on the need to maintain a degree of debt responsibility. Any option involving the sharing of national debts or the use of a common fiscal capacity to restructure the debts of one or more states risks becoming a driver of moral hazard. Governments might be inclined to abuse the system by incurring high deficits to boost their electoral popularity. The proposal we have is that the development of a common fiscal capacity should support the public procurement of assets and capital accumulation. The adoption of key performance indicators, KPIs, that drive the accumulation of capital could be useful in this context. The key element for comparing performance should not, however, be GDP, which is often affected by inflation and purchasing power. The KPIs should be based on a competence and capability approach as a way of supporting local communities in the present and consolidating a sustainable future for our children. A common debt that does not build better schooling, etc., is unacceptable. Thank you.
We have Jonathan.
Yeah, I have to say that something has gone terribly wrong. We need the microphone.
Oh, here we are.
I have to say that something has gone really seriously wrong here. This is not in any way a consensual document from the working group. Most of the participants haven't seen any of the propositions in question. We had two basic problems. One was just signal, which was the group was quite ideologically divided. I would say there was a center-left majority, which had little trouble reaching consensus, and a libertarian or Austrian minority, which, with which the other participants disagreed radically. Secondly, there's a procedural problem. Our rapporteur not only was from the minority faction, but she didn't show up to the second meeting, so we never moved to any propositions.
On that point, I'd just add that I did consult the organization and was told that the way that she was doing it was the correct way, and that the rapporteur's duty was to go away and to summarize the report, and that there shouldn't be a further meeting of the working group.
Hold on a second.
You know,
okay, John.
just a few points. For example, the arguments about debt at the end were not in any way representative of the position of the group. Similarly, the idea that we need a rapid return to orthodox monetary policies was not supported broadly by the group. There was certainly strong interest in the central fiscal capacity defined broadly in the way it's just been presented. I think that probably the way Marco Butti presented it yesterday in the plenary, that is to say that it would have one dimension which is European public goods provided by European institutions, and a second part which would be what he called distributed public goods financed by the EU but delivered at the national level. That probably would have had the strongest support. The last point is we spent a lot of time discussing the mandate of the ECB, and I would say that there was broad support in the majority, on the one hand for the view which was articulated that monetary and fiscal policy in practice were much more difficult to separate, and secondly that the ECB has a secondary mandate of supporting the economic policies of the EU insofar as they don't undermine the primary objectives of price stability and financial stability. And there was broad support for that, particularly as moves towards supporting the green transition. So I would say, you know, if you wanted to pick out a set of consensual or semi-consensual qualified majority views, they would be that one. And it really, this document should not be circulated with references to the views of the working group. That's really inappropriate also from a democratic point of view.
Okay, yes, we are talking about rejuvenating democracy, and it's from the organizer point of view, I must say that the 4 problem-solving groups self-organize themselves in 4 different ways. we still have to do an analytical research to understand which model is yielding the better results. But certainly, this working group, problem-solving group, was more polarized and more difficult than the others. Matteo, if I can ask you, my question is why, and then we are running late, and we need to go.
Why it was polarized?
Yes.
So first of all, I would like to defend a little bit our efforts. I believe that I have to thank all the participants, first of all, and my colleagues. I believe that the position was a little bit, the positions were polarized because there were basically three positions, no matter how we see it. So I will not make names, let's say, but there were pragmatist views, ambitious ones, and others that were, let's say, very, very grounded. Not grounded in the sense that they were too realistic, but sometimes they were, if not doctrinal, they were strict. Not necessarily in a negative way, but they were historically consistent. To this end, finding any functional form of consensus was inevitably impossible. However, one point I would like to underline is that each of these three positions viewed as the long-term approach as the most efficient one, the most consistent one, and the one that the European institutions should appeal. I believe that even though we can revise a little bit the document, the main positions that were, let's say, that probably are commonly defended are those one. We can discuss more about this, but I believe that we did the best we can.
Okay, no, absolutely. I have no doubt about that. Barbara will certainly call a further meeting in the next week with Jonathan, Marco, George, who's not here today, and John, of course, and everybody else, with you, Matteo, and the students. And you are rimandati a settembre. It's like we will not include this elaboration until you reach some consensus, okay? Which is not about voting in this very case. It's about reaching a common ground that is good for everybody. But let's clap for the effort. And let's go to, okay, it's welcome to the world of the learning robots. Quite funnily, the digital group had a much easier time than the group on fiscal, which is interestingly from an epistemological point of view.
So good morning, everyone. I'm glad that the biggest part of my group left, so probably I won't have the same problem of the previous one. But in any case, if any of my group is still around and wants to complement what I'm going to say, they're very much welcome to do that. Roberta?
Yeah, probably she can also come.
Do you want to join us? Okay. So, I'm Chiara Carrozza. I'm the program coordinator of the Center for a Digital Society of the European University Institute. So the topic of the working group is very much at the core of what we are doing, the work that we do at the university. Our group was quite diverse in terms of composition because it included both researchers, people involved in policymaking, the industry, and also one member of a standard setting body. So it also means that also in our case, perspectives were quite different, of course, not aligned on all the issues. Let me thank, before I start, the three students that contributed to the work on a topic that was not particularly familiar to them because of their background and also super complex topic. So I hope it was all in all a valuable experiences for them as well. So we had many questions to address in our working group, but we focused on just one. Is it possible to regulate better and less in the digital markets and digital societies? So our discussion started from a sort of normative questions that has nonetheless very concrete implications. So is regulation the right mean to control technology? This is, of course, not a new issue. We know that there is a time lag between the time of regulation and the time of technological evolution, but this is particularly important for AI, which is a technology that has an autonomous nature because it doesn't need human intervention to operate and to self-adapt or correct or change. The kind of latest evolution that is known as GPT is an autonomous, is an evolution of AI, which is an autonomous artificial intelligence that is able to autonomously assign and complete tasks. So is an example of that. So this introduced the big problem of technology that has also the potential to escape human control. And so safety of humankind emerges here is an actual, sinister problem. So everyone in the group, despite their, let's say, their background and their kind of interest and work in life, they agreed that some level of regulation is necessary to govern innovation. So the issue became, can we regulate better or more precisely in a different way our digital society? A distinction was made between regulation to protect a right, and GDPR is an example of that kind of regulation, versus regulation of a technology itself. In the case of general purpose technologies, such as artificial intelligence, this is quite problematic. Regulation of a technology in itself is something quite problematic. Another problem raised was the one of efficacy of regulation. So, cui prodest the regulation that is complicated or even impossible to implement or to monitor? And GDPR, again, is an example also in this kind of discussion. So the group basically identified 3 sets of potential solutions that needs, of course, to be further elaborated. They are just three groups of potential solutions. A first one relates to the crucial role of standards, and more precisely with standard design and tech diplomacy. So the proposal that was made was to shift from ex-post analysis and definition of existing technologies to elaborate standards into an ex-ante definition of behavioral standard ruling how technology should behave. So standards that provides mainly certification should be complemented by some kind of verification mechanism that enable the verification of compliance with existing regulations. So it's a different kind of approach in terms of how to design standards. Another point in this context discussed was the one that, of course, standards are not a merely technical or neutral activity. They are a social activity. And so it's important also to understand that there is a more broader politics also of standardization. So it was made a proposal in the sense of promoting the involvement of a more variegated community in standard setting activities. So it's something that is related in the terms of the person that proposed that to social justice. And last but not least, tech diplomacy. So it's needed, it's super important particularly for AI, to establish a minimal set of rules that are agreed globally, not just regionally. So we normally tend to think to international institutions or just public institutions as the natural forum for this kind of discussion, but it's important to involve other kind of stakeholders of the society in this kind of effort. And I think that just yesterday I read about the creation of a global table for discussing a minimal level of rules that should be globally accepted. Second set of proposal relates to data policy, because AI, but more in general, digital technology regulation is mostly not only, but mostly a matter of data policy, a matter of data regulation and data policy. A problem that was discussed in the working group is that there is still a limited use of digital technology. For example, in the case of cloud, it was commented that the level of adoption is very low, like 22%, I didn't know that, but 22%, just 22% of European companies uses cloud. So it emerged a problem of trust in the management and in the sharing of data. And also a paradox if we think to people that are more likely to share their data with social media than for other kind of purposes. And in this sense, it's super important in tapping the potential of data for public purposes. This is something for what is needed, a sort of a new social contract for data that should be based on transparency, but also on a kind of clear incentives for users, for citizens, a clear reward. Yesterday we heard and we discussed during a proposal time a proposal that goes exactly in this direction. So how do we build a framework for data sharing that has some chances of working in this field? So Europe could contribute to build up a mechanism related to data, to sharing data for common good purposes. Let's think to the potential of data in sectors such as healthcare, education, and foster the uses of data should not be based only, of course, on regulation, but should be complemented by positive incentives, clear positive incentives, and education. So digital literacy is, of course, an area where Europe should invest and should be present. There is a parallel here. It was made a parallel with the media sector, the work that is done in the media sector to contrast disinformation. We connect with regulation, a platform, self-regulation to remove harmful contexts. But if you don't invest in fostering media literacy to empower the users, you won't achieve important results in this field. Lastly, third point, beyond regulation, the need to finance a public infrastructure for AI in Europe. So just a couple of elements of context here. So according to the Stanford report of 2023, until 2014, the majority of machine learning systems were released by academia. But since then, the industry took over. Private investment, we know, are more or less 3 times public investments in the field, and the gap is increasing. And also there is a lot of research that is documenting a growing net flow of researchers from academia to industry, and particularly from elite institutions into technology companies, Google, Microsoft, Facebook. So a concrete action should be taken to develop a large foundational model in Europe. This is something that doesn't exist, that no single institution has the capacity to build. And we need that because we need to have models that embeds by design the values that Europe wants to preserve, that we believe are worth preserving. More in general, of course, the EU institutions, also in collaboration with industry, third parties should invest in research centers and engage in the promotion of university courses, training, professional training, but also reskilling of those already in the labor market in the field of AI. And this could lead to some kind of model. We have examples internationally like Korea. I know it's not particularly culturally close to us, but Korea is a very successful model of cooperation in this field between the private sector and the public actors. This is it for the proposals, some thoughts towards the elaboration of proposal. One suggestion that emerged over lunchtime from the working group is that in the next edition, the green and the digital transition should be, let's say, discussed also jointly, because one of the very big issues is related to the impact of the deployment of digital technologies on environment and on climate. This is something that in the future will be extremely relevant and deserve discussion. This is it.
Thank you very much. Talking about suggestion for the next conference, I think we Jonathan's remarks were extremely useful. Your suggestions are very useful. We will conclude with a wrap-up on what we learned and how to do better in the future. It's to do problem solving is not always so straightforward, notwithstanding what McKinsey thinks, but McKinsey does make problem solving in a much more simpler context. Roberto, you want to add something?
Chiara has been told, synthesized everything. I wanted just to add something about keeping advantage of the fact that we are the last group, because listening to all the proposals and all the groups, it came in my mind that digital is, of course, all the groups are interrelated, but digital in some ways, it's a common umbrella, because for example, the proposal on democracy that were very interesting and also had the advantage of being very, very feasible, non-feasible politically, but simple, precise. Maybe let's think about the impact on digital environment, on information that is on the media context that is basic, relevant for the the public opinion and the functioning of the democracy. I say this also because in the discussion about the forthcoming Media Freedom Act, this fact that we are going to vote for European elections, it can be a legal basis for the European Commission to legislate or to enter in this field that until now it's a national competence. The second is, of course, the environment, as Chiara told, and also about all the discussion on fiscal capacity. We discussed a lot, we are discussing a lot, and we discussed it in our group about the several aspects of the digital challenge, and there is also this small problem of the taxes. And yesterday, the group, the panel was about the fiscal capacity of European Union, and maybe at some point we should cross the problem, the issues, and understand if the new regime of taxation that is inside the OECD process, so it is already on the route, can enter in this discussion. So digital as a trade union. And thank you.
Robert needs to get ready for the next session. We are late of 10 minutes. Are there any urgent... Robert is getting ready for the next session. Is there any urgent question on digital? We very much expect this debate to go on in the next days, especially the one on fiscal, but it seems that we are yes, there is a question. No, it's just okay. Very good. Because
it's an approval from Paul.
By the way, we also have a very concrete, revolutionary, wide proposal from Paul that Jan Piotrowski has elaborated a little bit, so that is even more understandable. And let's go now to the semi-last session on Europe doing less and better with Robert and Elisabeth, Rob, and Antonio with Jan chairing. Thank you very much.
Recognize it. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. I'm going to kick off with Robert, that's okay. I'll do a brief introduction. And then we'll get going.
Double X chromosome cluster.
Conversation, however you want to do it. Do you want to have me on the wall? You okay? Careful, be careful. Yep. Are you okay? I'm okay. I think if Anna-Elizabeth, if you go here next to me, I'm going to sit here. Ah, yes, if Anna
They
Elizabeth
want
goes
a
here.
double X person in the middle to look good on the picture.
Yeah, just be careful, Rob. We don't want to lose you. Rob, are you joining the panel?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I surprise. Change it and start with.
We'll start with Rob, yeah.
And then we'll go to a kind of.
I just want to make sure everyone's got access to a mic. Session number 5. If we can just have your attention. Your panel is assembled. Yes, welcome to plenary session number 5. Our title is A Europe That Does Less But Better, Building a More Democratic and Transparent EU. Can I just ask, if you're interested in hearing the session, please join us. But if you're not, there's coffee outside. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Yes, our topic is A Europe That Does Less But Better, Building a More Democratic and Transparent EU. I'm Ian Martin, a columnist for The Times in London. I'm also director of the London Defence Conference, which is the annual geopolitical gathering at King's College, London. Now, it might be thought slightly strange to have a Brit to chair this session. The British, some might say, have been doing less but worse in recent years. However, the events of recent years have, I hope, allowed me to bring me as your chair some perspective on the EU and how it operates. We've heard a lot of very interesting proposals in the last 3 days for Europe to do more on climate, on defense, on security, on everything, it seems. This session is predicated on a different approach, doing less but better. We'll consider if that is possible, what might it look like in practical terms, and we'll explore how Europe might become more democratic and transparent. We have four great panelists, as well as our host, including our host, Rob Tyler, known to you all. Antonio Parenti, head of the European Commission representation in Italy, and Elizabeth Moutet, a leading journalist from the Daily Telegraph based in Paris, and Rob Roos, MEP, who is vice chair of the European Conservatives and Reformists group. And I'm going to call on Rob to kick things off. I know you have clear, robust views on this subject, on what needs to happen. So Rob, the floor is yours to get us going.
Thank you very much. Well, Europe does less but better. Sounds very good. I think it's also very necessary. And I will start directly with my conclusion. The EU is eroding national democracy. It abuses each and every crisis, from COVID-19 to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, to gain more power. National veto rights have been abolished on most subjects, even the foreign policy, and defense may follow soon. The European Economic Community was about free trade, but the European Union is about much more than that. Member states are no longer in control. It is the European Commission that has the right of legislative initiative. 35,000 civil servants do everything they can for the sake of an ever closer union each and every day. The EU is threatening to steamroll our economy and our democracy. Think of the Green Deal, the Migrant Pact, or the impending nature restoration law, or the ban on cars with a combustion engine. We are about to embark on a radical and irresponsible experiment with our economy, and I'm not sure we will be fine. Meanwhile, the European Parliament is an applause machine, or as the Dutch Prime Minister Rutte once said, a festivity committee in search of a festivity. We do not have the power to send individual commissioners packing. The rules of procedure also make it impossible for us to have a proper debate. And transparency is a word completely alien to the EU institutions. It is impossible to receive the information we need to truly keep the Commission in check. So the remarkable reality is that power resides in Brussels, but democratic procedures do not function. Meanwhile, these procedures still function reasonably well in many EU member states, but power does not reside there anymore. The result is that power evades both control and democratic participation. We need a different EU, an EU that works for the people again, that makes people's lives better, not more complicated, not more expensive, and that's what we see today. It's not often that I praise the French President Macron, but last year he came up with a very good idea, the European political community. My suggestion, turn this into an EU of multiple directions, multiple speeds and multiple viewpoints. Let us all have a high degree on economic cooperation with legislative unification in this regard, but let countries decide for themselves on what issues they wish to cooperate further. I would be happy for the Netherlands to move to Tier 2, alongside perhaps the UK. Let the European Commission become a secretariat, the European Parliament an inter-parliamentary body consisting of representatives from the national parliaments, and let the Council have the lead, all on an intergovernmental basis with full veto powers restored. A union in which national democracy matters again, a union à la carte. Let us strive for this. I believe that this is the only way trust in politics can be restored. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anne-Elizabeth, your perspective.
Good morning. First of all, I will not be as severe as yours, but he's got a certain point, and that point is that Europe, the Europe of Brussels deciding and citizens in their own countries having to abide by whatever is decided somewhere which is not their capital, is seen and perceived as undemocratic, and perception is reality in politics. And so we have seen often, more and more, we've seen the victory of populist parties. We've seen the worse, even worse than that, I would say, because those parties were elected. But we've also seen movements that were uncontrolled. We've seen conspiracy theorists. We've seen, in my own country, in France, rebellion against seemingly minor measures being taken, essentially because there is this feeling of disaffection. And what I would say that essentially, like every organization, according to Parkinson's law, expands to fill the void available in order to to exist. It's a question of pushback within the same institutions. I would say that Europe has just taken up a space against which everybody reacts. And this is dangerous for our democracies. It is dangerous for Europe itself, because a Europe that is not accepted by its citizens will not be able to, at some time, take measures that are necessary for the continent itself. And so we have a system which certainly has been developing according a framework that had been sort of laid out by the founders and the followers, but it has become something that's seen as a monster, and if it's seen and perceived as a monster, it becomes a monster. So that's our real problem. I think we're at fault. I would like someone to name me a European country that sends commissioners that they respect in their own country rather than putting them out to pasture. And both France and Britain, when it was a member of the EU, were a very good example of sending out to Brussels people to whom you wanted to guarantee a sinecure. That's one thing. Show me a list of MP elections where you have MEP elections in which you have candidates that are candidates who have the same ambition and influence in their country than the ones who run for the national parliaments. And so if we sort of have an attitude of benign neglect towards European institutions, the European institutions will develop on their own, and that, I think that is what we're witnessing now, and that is something that we ought to think about very, very seriously. I would say that there are instances in which an emergency forces a continent to work together. I am not saying the EU worked so well on the pandemic, but the pandemic was essentially one instance in which we needed a common response for the very obvious reason that any virus hasn't waited for Schengen to be able to travel among our countries. So my response to the question that's been lobbed to us, and I hope we can discuss it with you, is how do we put back a sort of immediacy of decision? How do we put back feedback from the nations into Europe? How do we put back trust between local politicians and national politicians and European politicians? There are plenty of good people in Brussels. They do not always get their word because of a system that has become increasingly bureaucratic, but that is our fault. It is our responsibility. The framework itself is not unsuited to democracy, but it's been allowed to grow where it could, and it has, because that's the nature of organizations. So let's, I think, talk about how we rein this back in and work from what we've got, which is mostly what things should be about.
Thank you very much. Antonio, you are head of the European Commission representation in Italy. You have a very different perspective.
Since I'm the monster, do you want me to go right last or
Next, please.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I mean, when Francesco asked me to join this panel, I had a real sense of déjà vu, and yeah, I mean, when I was saying Francesco invited me to join this panel, I had a strong sense of déjà vu. It felt a little bit, if you allow me, a bit of a, I call it the vintage panel. And the vintage panel is because I'm not out of respect to you, but because do less but better was the motto of a president of the Commission, which even you, which are all Euro insider, may even forget, Jacques Santer. I mean, if you go out here, 500 meters away from this place, unless you end up in a Luxembourger, no one will remember who Jacques Santer was. And actually, I think it was a very good reason for that, because Jacques Santer was the one who produced and promoted of doing less but better. And what has happened, if you want, from that period until today is that the Europe indeed has maintained the less. The problem is that we are doing more with less since 2001. It is an increasingly bureaucratic institution, and sorry to say, I think the reason for that lays mostly in what Kinnock proposed as a reform back in 2000. He made the European Commission an incredibly unattractive place to work, and he made the European institution and the European system incredibly cumbersome. Today, I, as a manager, spend 60%, 70% of my time making sure that I spend correctly €1. To spend €1, I have to go through 5 documents, okay? So I'm spending most of my time not managing, not steering, but making sure that each and every euro is spent correctly, which is good, except for the fact that you can always put me in jail if I don't do it rightly. But this having said, Europe is not filling a void that has been created. It's the world that has changed. Look at what happened 2 days ago with the deal on migration. Piantedosi, which I don't think is the Italian Minister of Interior, which I don't think you can call it a left-wing person, said, I'm very happy that we managed to come out with the idea of giving to the European Commission more power to manage our external border. That's the reality. There's things member states can no longer do. The crisis of the pandemic is clear. Sorry, the crisis of the environment is another clear direction. Member states cannot reply to those crises alone. They need to do it together at European level if we want to give an answer which is for the citizens. Now this brings me to the last point. Accountability and democratic process in the European Union. Frankly speaking, I never bought this. You have so much information about what is going on about the European Union that the problem is eventually understanding it. The problem of democratic accountability of the European Union is a problem of ignorance of the European Union. People do not know where to find information. People do not know what the European Union is. In my own experience, 3 years in this job, when I go out and talk to the people, 80% of those who ask, to whom I ask, how many member states has the European Union? 80% of the respondents don't get the answer right. That is the problem. People don't understand what the European Union does, and this is largely our fault of institutions. And therefore, when they ask to express their opinion, to send their representative to Brussels, they don't think about what is going to happen in Brussels. They think at the local result, at the national result. But you have an extreme amount of accountability in the European Union. I find much easier to find information about what's going on at the European Commission than on what is going on at the European Parliament, at the Italian Parliament in Rome, because much more of this information is available, not at the same level at national level. So I think we need to give to our citizens the information and then let them choose what type of government, what type of governance they want. But we need to fill the void of lack of information and start really thinking of where the responses to the current crisis are better suited. It's called, I forgot the name now, but I mean, we need really to find where to lie the better responses. And then in a lot of things, the better responses are at national level, but in a lot of things, the better responses are at European level. But then if we want to do those responses at European level, then we need to equip the European Union with the means to do those responses. The European Union has, as of today, a budget of 1% of the European Union GDP. The American federal budget is 24% of the national GDP. Thank you.
Thank you. Bring in now Robert Tyler of New Direction. What does this concept of doing less but better look like as far as you're concerned?
I think if I want to start with one point, sort of as the other Brit on the panel, as sort of reflection on how would I put it? You don't miss something until it's gone. And I think this is something that the United Kingdom has discovered, not in terms of an emotional connection to Europe, but I think the civil service has discovered. What we find is that the Commission has in effect created a kind of government by autopilot. I think something that Britain has had to adjust to after Brexit is realizing just how many competencies were handed to Brussels in the first place, and how resource intensive it is to suddenly handle these areas again. You consider migration policy, agricultural subsidies, education subsidies through Erasmus, research grants, trade, all of these things that were handed to Brussels have suddenly, the British government, I think, has, as you said, sort of struggled a little bit with this idea of how it, readjusts to taking those competencies back. And I think something quite alarming came out of all this. It was a realization of just how much had been passed away from our own control. And you know, the debate continues in the UK at the moment about what to do with the acquis communautaire, how should we handle it, how should we integrate it into our own laws, which regulation should we strip away and which regulation should we keep. And it's become an interesting sort of political debate because there's on the one hand the need to maintain it in order to have trade with Europe, but on the other hand, the realization of just how burdensome some of that regulation really is. And this is where I come to my sort of view on what less but better means. I think that what's lacking in some regard is a kind of intellectual diversity in Brussels. I think that what you find is a lot of people in the Commission succumb to groupthink. And because of the nature of how the Commission works, it's very much compartmentalized into the different DGs. People don't peer over the wall into the next compartment. So quite often you have people duplicating regulation, or even worse, creating contradictory regulation that eventually business has to interpret. And that becomes a major problem. And one of the challenges I always set people in Brussels, especially people working in the Commission, is I tell them, go through the process of registering a small and medium-sized enterprise. Just fill in for fun the paperwork and just see how much there is and see what the hoops are that you're going through and see what a barrier we're creating to innovation. And I think that the other side of that is that some of the regulation I have no doubt was made in the best intentions. However, it stymies innovation. Let me give you an example. I mean, recently we all sort of celebrated the introduction of the common charger. You know, the tyranny of the lightning port on the iPhone is over. We're all going to use USB-C. However, if you consider the sort of way that technology evolves and develops, you realize that it's the equivalent of if we said in the 1990s, let's decide that VHS is going to be the only platform for displaying video content. You know, you freeze technology in a certain era and it kind of stymies innovation. You know, the reason why Apple keeps changing its charger is because they get faster, they transfer more energy, they become more efficient. We've effectively frozen ourselves out. I think another kind of good intention policy that has had a negative consequence would, for example, be the carbon trading scheme. You know, there are kind of loopholes that we found in that. For example, it stymied innovation in carbon capture technology because we're on the sort of cusp of a renaissance of what we call carbon capture utilization. It's this idea that the carbon you have captured from industry can be recycled into other products. Well, unfortunately, that was left out of the EU's taxonomy. So what does that mean? Carbon capture companies are taxed twice under the carbon capture scheme. The first time when they've captured the carbon at source, and the second time when they've turned the carbon into something else. So even though there's a net loss of carbon on the chain, they're being taxed as though they're producing it twice. And you sort of realize that there are these kind of areas of regulation that have developed without a kind of regard to its real-world impact. And I know that the argument that the Commission will always make is, well, this is the role of Parliament, or this is this is where industry should be lobbying the Commission directly. But you start to realize that small and medium-sized enterprises just don't have the resources to access Brussels in the same way. It is very expensive to maintain an office in Brussels. It is very expensive to come to Brussels to lobby the Commission and the Parliament. And even then, do they have the access? Do they know who they're supposed to talk to? One of the issues is transparency, is who in the chain of command in the Commission do you talk to about certain policies before they're implemented or before they're devised? And you find that what that creates is a kind of modern-day mercantilism, that the only people who can really get access to the Commission are big business and big corporations who can create regulation that suits them, that gives them the upper hand over their rivals. One of the notable cases from the UK was about when they talked about the energy efficiency of vacuum cleaners. Well, it was obvious that it was Miele versus Dyson. The company Dyson, which was less efficient at the time but has since caught up, was effectively going to be hampered by a kind of standardization of how you create vacuum cleaners. And they weren't able to lobby in the same way because they didn't have the same kind of access. And you find that in a lot of other areas as well. So I think we need to kind of adjust to this idea of a greater degree of intellectual diversity in Brussels. We need to engage, perhaps the way the Commission hires people needs to change. Perhaps they need to sort of look at how they can bring in secondments from business, for example, or how they can bring in more secondments from the member states, rather than this sort of, you know, carbon copy blueprint of what the average commissioner is. You know, somebody, you know, they might come from different member states, but they all think the same. And I think that's the main problem that needs to be overcome.
Terrific, thank you. We're going to bring in the audience in a few minutes' time, but just a question for the panel. And although we are observing Chatham House rule, we're off the record. Antonio will probably, for obvious reasons, have to be more circumspect in answering this question because of his role. But what do each of the panelists think about the elections next year? Do they offer a chance for a new dispensation, a new way of doing things, if we accept this premise that Europe needs to do less better? Rob?
Well, we have to look forward to that. I'm not sure. We have to see what's going on. What we see now is there is a shift in the European Union going on. Let's say we have more conservative governments, and that means that we also have a different council, European Council. Yeah, that means that there can be a blocking minority on all these regulations. And I think it's necessary. What Robert says, I fully agree. I'm still a businessman. I became active in politics by accident, but I had my own businesses, and it was not doable anymore. There's so many regulations coming to all these SMEs, and you cannot keep up with that. It was for me the reason to sell a lot of my companies. And this is not, it's just not good. We see a lot of SMEs stopping their businesses. 75% of our employment is from small businesses. 50% of the GDP of the EU is from small businesses. And there is where innovation is coming from. And in my perspective, the Commission think that innovation comes from more regulation, but it's the other way around. Regulation follows innovation, and that's something I hope the Commission will look outside and also talk to real small businesses and not only talk about that. But yeah, about the question, I think next year we have elections. Maybe what we see now also in my country, the Netherlands, we had a landslide win of the farmers' citizens movement. People are fed up with all these regulations and with immigration, with rising prices because of the energy transition, which is, it's just, I'm not against the energy transition, but the way we do it is just not right. It's not helping nature, and people are seeing that. So I think there will be, there will be a shift. Thank you.
And Elizabeth, do you think next year there's the prospect of some change? I mean, considering that there's potentially quite a bit of institutional inertia in parts of Brussels in the system. Yeah.
What worries me about the next elections, and incidentally, this is not separate from national elections. Most people who vote in European elections will vote according to decisions and political choices that they've made in their own country. So, and many politicians use this as a kind of sort of cheap referendum, so to speak, in order to know where they're going and how that works. So already we've got something that, you know, it's the nature of the beast. It's normal that people would be interested in sending people whose opinions they have a better grasp on than somebody who would be sort of purely into European matters. Again, that is the problem of the Commission and of the European institution, that it has managed to make itself remote while intervening in so many aspects of people's lives. But let's look for 1 minute of how Europe is actually used in all sorts of ways by the parties that compete. In many countries, Europe is used as a cheap way of explaining that, yes, you're going to fight the beast. And I'm not just talking about countries in Central Europe, I'm also talking about our own countries. If something is wrong, it's Brussels' fault. If something is right, it's because I've achieved it. So that is something that's a danger. We have fed populists. We've also fed the opposite. We've fed parties that say, look, we're unable to do anything, which in effect is the equivalent of saying our country has no agency, and that is not making your voters happy. And send me to Brussels and I will do it. I think even the conditions in which European politics, even though when you listen to the debates at the European Parliament, I speak as a French woman, it is a thing that makes me much more optimistic than when I see in my own parliament. People do not fight, people do not table 30,000 amendments, it's a fairly serious place. There's an element of sort of proportionality that actually is felt. One of the ways in which we could try and grab back a certain modicum of influence would be to take European elections seriously. And all parties should, the parties that we don't like actually already take European elections seriously. So if you want Europe to be still there, but do things in a better way, there ought to be within political parties, and it should be seriously encouraged, how do we tackle the list we send? We're not thanking people we want to go out to pasture, but how to create a policy that is that takes into account the goal and takes into account what our voters are telling us.
Antonio, is there potential for institutional reform?
I think there is a huge need for institutional reform, especially if we're moving towards enlargement. Isn't it going to be possible to enlarge to other countries with these rules, especially with unanimity being still the main form of decision-making in the EU? Honestly, it's difficult at 27. It's going to be impossible at 32, 33. I totally agree with Anne. That would be the great way to look at the next elections. I mean, if people were really discussing about Europe and not national politics and national politics, I wish it happens. I wish I see that one day. I'm not sure. Will there be a change? I think it's very early to say. What I noticed, though, is there's a lot of confusion. I mean, there's, of course, an absolutely legitimate attempt to shift from the current, what is often called the Ursula majority, towards a PPE, ECR type of majority. If you look at the polls right now, that doesn't seem to be enough. Then the big debate will be, will they expand to ID, the other group? Would that be acceptable for the Popular Party? Will they go to Macron? Would Macron be happy to go with a party which may somewhat facilitate the rise of Le Pen or whoever in France? Or we will see at the end again a grosse coalition in Europe. If I had to bet, I guess I would bet on the last one.
Thank you. Robert, just before I bring the audience in, I mean, the backdrop to all of this, we shouldn't forget, is economics, and it is recession. And essentially, the Eurozone is in recession. Outside the EU, the UK is flirting with the idea of recession, high inflation, which may soon turn into deflation. That usually equals, those are usually conditions that are good for populism and for political rebellion. How do you see it?
Well, you know, as conservatives who take a sort of more pragmatic approach to Europe than, say, the sort of far-right and far-left populists who would rather do away with the whole thing, it's greatly concerning. I mean, one of the things we look at is, for example, the rise of a pro-Russian, you know, anti-European majority in places like Austria, France. In Belgium, we see, you know, extremist parties like Vlaams Belang and the communists doing much better than they were in history. And I think really if we want to put a kind of backstop on this populism, we need to start taking seriously the prospect of reform. And I think actually we're starting to see a bit of a sea change in the way that the EPP is talking about Europe. They're starting to say, you know, push back against some of the more social democratic reforms. They're starting to say that, you know, we need to take fiscal solvency seriously. We need to take things like migration seriously. We need to sort of tackle these issues that populists are talking about. Otherwise, we risk having a kind of situation where there's no possible majority in the European institutions. If we reach a point where the far left and the extreme right have bigger groups, there's no possible coalition that could be formed, and it would create this sort of deadlock. So I think from the sort of conservative perspective, it's important that we start taking these reforms seriously. Otherwise, as you said, you know, the economic backdrop could spell a sort of rise in people like Marine Le Pen, or you could say the resurgence of Salvini or Vlaams Belang or any other of these sort of dangerous parties. And you know, it has international repercussions as well. They're anti-American. They want to destroy the transatlantic alliance. They're pro-Russian in a lot of cases. They're sort of lukewarm on China. You know, these are fundamental issues that we face in the future.
Now, who has the first question? I mean, we're running slightly late, so with Francesco's permission, I think I'll bring it to a sort of hard stop in about 15 minutes, which will earn back a little bit of time for the next session. But who has the first question? So should we take a question right at the back and then to the front? Do we have a mic in the room?
My question, considering what we have done in these 2-3 days, was about sort of, it is a proposal, so I would be very much interested to your reaction, to sort of establish that regulation that are not known by their constituency, by their targets, are abolished. So to establish that there is some minimum threshold of understandability of regulation, beyond which the regulation is not valid any longer.
Point at the back. A point here and then at the back.
Yes, no, it's very, very interesting to hear all these reflections and to see always the theme of give control back to people coming over and over again. But obviously that's a very wide kind of idea, and it's important to understand what you mean, especially because it's such a central point of your message. Last year, between April 2021 and May 2021, there was one of the biggest citizen-centered exercise, the Conference on the Future of Europe, which asked people everywhere in Europe what they wanted. And the result is part of the Conference on the Future of Europe that should bring forward the reforms. So my question to you is in which way did you interacted with this extraordinary democratic exercise? What did you bring in that debate? How actively did you participate in it? And if you can just give us a very bullet point summary of what did you do then? Thank you.
Good question. Let's answer that question. Each panelist, we have your perspective, and then straight after that, but two points which I suspect are related here and then right at the back. Rob.
Well, let me start with the last question. Maybe that's easy because the Conference of the Future of Europe. Well, if you look how that was organized, it was, well, the people who were involved were really cherry-picked, hand-picked, all people who are very pro-European Union. So the people were called, and are you willing to be part of this panel? The people who are interested in the European Union said yes, but people who were not interested in this panel said no. So you don't have a real balanced picture of the society of the European Union. So it was done by the liberals and we, as I'm a member of the ECR, and the ECR was not invited. So it was the EPP, the Socialists, the Greens, but the ID group and the ECR, we were not even invited. So how democratic is that to have a discussion, to have a more democratic Europe, while excluding at the same time, let's say, the conservatives, because that's a sound you don't want to hear. So I was not very enthusiastic about this. I was not involved by myself, but my colleague was, because we needed a very gender-balanced panel, but we as ECR, we were not invited with the rest. So I was not very enthusiastic, and I think it's not, it died a sudden death. It was quiet at a certain time. Then about, can you repeat your question again? Because
it's essentially the concept of a almost sunset clause on regulation. That if
oh yes, yes, that's true.
regulation is not
That's true.
understood, it
Well,
automatically
yes,
fades.
that's true. Ursula von der Leyen said at the start of her mandate, for every rule that comes in, a rule goes out. Well, it didn't happen. There is more and more regulation. It's incredible. That's what I said. They think that innovation starts by making regulation, and that's not the case. And also what Robert said, that's the truth. All these big corporates, they have access to the highest level of the European Commission, but people with small businesses, and they are so very important for our European community. They don't have access. They don't have time. They work. I was an entrepreneur myself. I worked 17 hours since I started my companies. I worked 17 hours a week, but because I believed in things. And then I see this commission coming up with all this regulation, and it's going on. We have this in the United States, that we have a lot of discussions now about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a thing that worries the Commission a lot. I'm not concerned about that at all. If they want to invest, subsidize, we can compete with them if we bring down the regulations. I asked for a 30% decrease of regulation, and it was adopted. And nothing happened. And I think there's the problem. So they promise, but they don't do it.
Just going to very keen to get to these two questions. Robert, just a point quickly.
No, I just wanted to follow up on the kind of conference on the future of Europe thing. I mean, the ECR group itself did run a kind of parallel structure, which is they took a conference around the continent. So they had meetings in almost every single capital city where they engaged with the public, they engaged with national legislators, they recorded the whole thing, it was entirely transparent, they came up with their own conclusions, they filed them into the system for the Conference of the Future of Europe. We as New Direction did the same thing. We had events around Europe, we filed our suggestions into the Conference of the Future of Europe. Nothing. We were basically watered out. You know, the bulk of sort of more interested parties from the left that put in suggestions were taken more seriously than the things we were saying. And, you know, we were talking about things like deregulation. We were talking about things like giving more of a voice to citizens. We were talking about things like increasing the sort of voice of the things like the Committee of Regions so that the local government has more of a say in what's happening on a European level. We were talking about things like a sort of smarter approach to regulation. You know, there was a lot of talk about European army and things like that in the Conference on the Future of Europe. Well, we said, no, the European army is not necessary. Actually, if you want to add value to European foreign policy, DARPA. United States pours billions of dollars into research and development. It puts it way ahead of the rest of the world in military technology, and it has civilian impact as well. Europe doesn't do that. If we want to add value to European military and European defense, let's come up with a common platform for research and development.
Yeah. And Elizabeth, you have a quick point before we move.
Yes, quick point. I'm not a technician of Europe. I'm a journalist reporting on many things, and many of them European or impacting European countries. And every time one of those consultations goes on and nothing is done, there's yet another strike against the perception of Europe. And I don't think that this can last forever. We then have those polls that reveal a degree of animosity against the whole institution and a larger degree of cynicism and disinterest. And every time that this is not happening, every time that, for instance, the idea of striking down bureaucracy is not followed, layers of bureaucracy and layers of regulation are not followed by any effect, you have more voters for the last year of the populist parties. This is not sustainable, and that really is what worries me.
Question here.
Yeah, good morning. Perhaps a comment from somebody like me who is a convinced transatlanticist, but also a convinced citizen of Europe. And I'm sorry? Okay, so I'm saying I would like to make one comment and then one question, not only as a convinced transatlanticist, but also as a convinced citizen of Europe. So my first comment, I think we should not lose sight of the historic achievement and really the visionary success of Europe as a peace project. So I'm saying this also as a German. So if we didn't have Europe, we would not have Europe whole and at peace. So I think this should not be left out of sight. Second, European countries, if Europe wants to be a global actor, every European country is comparatively small. Some are a bit bigger, some are smaller, but individually they are small. So the only way how Europe can really have a voice on global scale is if it sticks together. So that brings me to my point that if you want to move forward, or if we want to move forward, I think the question is not less Europe, it's better Europe. So, and that brings me to my question. How would you, I would see three areas where Europe could actually do better, and I would welcome your thoughts. So one is on how could Europeans' capacity to act be improved, i.e. how could the unanimity in many areas eventually be avoided? Yeah? So that's one aspect. Second, how could the rule of law be improved? Case of Hungary. And then how could the legitimacy be improved? And that goes also into transparency. So could there be, for example, a direct election of the President of the European Commission? Thank you.
Well, no, I wish actually two panels together because we have a panel next and what next, etc. But I can't resist commenting on praising really this panel for the realism and the pragmatism that the conservative family in Europe often shows. I, for one, as an academic, looking at the understanding of the European Parliament, I often explain that Euroscepticism can be existential, that you just want to blow the whole thing up, or it can be constructive and transformative, that there are real deep problems, and when you have starry-eyed Euro-idealism that translates into kind of a systematic either centralization or unity above all, what I call the one-voice mantra, we don't do service to Europe. Friends have to be critical friends. So then for me, the question is, that's my mindset, more of as a bit on the other side of the aisle, if we want to put it that way, social democrat, progressive, although maybe that's not a term people like. But I'm kind of thinking in Gramscian terms. What is a bloc, or maybe a counter-hegemonic bloc? What is the possible alliances? Probably not political, but at least ideational, for indeed bringing the EU in that direction of all the wonderful words that you used, Rob, smart regulation, polycentric, decentralized, owned by the people, all of these things, access to power by all, absolutely. And indeed, Kofi had a bias selection problem. So, yeah, but we shouldn't throw the whole thing out. We should think about how you select citizens in these kinds of settings, right? At least according to me, because you've got to be consistent. If you want to have citizens in, you should want to have deliberative democracy. Maybe you will come back to this next panel. So, I call for it. It's too late for this, panel, because you guys don't have much time left. But, I mean, this is a really, really important conversation. And we shouldn't make it into a caricature and to a kind of binary left-right or pro-EU against EU, because that won't lead us to the necessary reforms.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Time for a question at the back.
I'll go on the other straight of Calypso, in the sense that politics in the European Parliament is based on two axes, left and right, and pro-European, anti-European. The coalition, to enter a majority coalition in the European Parliament, you need to decide if you want to be a right-wing party that accepts that the Union is not to be dismantled but to be strengthened, or remain mainly an anti-European bloc, and then you will stay out of the majority because the EPP may be able to, and the Liberal won't be able to make an alliance with you. I think that what you've mentioned about the change in the balance of power in the European Council should allow the Conservative being in government to see that they cannot do without the Union, as Antonio pointed out with Piantedosi yesterday, so can help with the evolution of the ECR to be more effective in getting maybe more right-wing policies at the European level, but rather strengthening European policies than trying to reduce them.
Very last one, and then Eric.
I want to echo what Calypso said in the sense that, I go to a lot of these meetings and I very rarely see a panel that has a more skeptical voice. And so it's wonderful to have the stimulus of having you here. I had three different questions, really. Rob, I'm curious. I remember going to Brussels for the first time in 1989, and the whole conversation in the SME community was about the difficulty of doing business when they confronted 13 different national regulatory regimes and couldn't actually manage the paperwork of trying to do business across borders. And the completion of the internal market was meant to do away with that. Now you're telling me that we should go back in reverse in order to get away from regulation. So how do we square that particular circle? And I guess my second question is really about the relationship between democratic disaffection and European integration. I come from the United States. Obviously, we're not part of the European Union. Our democracy is doing terribly right now. And I would say the same thing for Brazil, and India is struggling. And so all these non-European countries are really experiencing terrible democratic dysfunction. To what extent is it really possible for us to believe that most of the democratic dysfunction that we see at the national level in Europe actually comes from the existence of the European Union? Because I think if you took the European Union away, all that democratic dysfunction would still exist, and we'd still be facing populism and all the rest. And I say that as a person who edits a journal that publishes, I would say, 60% of the academic work on populism today. And I guess the third question that I have really is about the extent to which the European Union solving problems actually gets the kind of credibility that it deserves, right? And this, I think, is a point that was well made. Very often when Europe solves problems, the solution is viewed as national. Is this a communications issue that we could address, where we can actually give credit to the European Union for the achievements that it has? I wonder if that would ever make a difference in the way we perceive the European Union.
Thanks a lot, Eric.
Thank you very much. I think
we start the panel at
yeah,
45,
so
10 minutes.
We're kind of, well, we've got 10 minutes. Excellent. Okay, well, so I'm just going to move through the panel, begin with Anne-Elisabeth, respond. There's so much to respond to there. There are about 5 different questions, but so pick one.
Well, the nice American gentleman at the back. I would like to point out that going through Brexit showed how much of the imbrication of regulation, economy, European national sort of regulation sort of exists and actually more or less works. And when you try to break away from it, you realize how difficult it is. I'm not going to condemn people who voted for Brexit, but I'm not sure that most of them realized how incredibly difficult it would be. I remember that the president of the Fondation Robert Schuman in Paris predicted that unmaking and re-signing, all the different treaties and regulations and conditions to operate in sync with the continental economy would take 9 years. The likelihood is that it will take much more than that. And so without taking sides, I would say that there's a layer that has been put. It is not perfect. It is sometimes unwieldy. It's certainly there ought to be consideration, but it's something that is not perceived, but it does exist, which is why disrupting it is difficult. And the other thing that I would like to say is that the Commission, because it's found itself increasingly holding most of the power, more than Parliament, which ought not be right, has become unbelievably smug. I have been witness to attempts by a large financial industry to work on financial regulation. It's the insurance industry. And they were trying to change the conditions of Solvency II, which ensures that insurance companies can pay out insurance policies over the next 30, 40 years, so long term. This change in the regulation, which is necessary because the instruments were more and more complex, and the previous regulation was really like an abacus, not something very complex, came right at the middle of the financial crisis of 2008. The result was that everybody in charge at the Department of something in pensions, that would, the Department of Financial Regulation and, worked so that they would not be responsible for another financial crisis. What they then, the gist of the problem that was they said, look, to all those institutions, insurance companies hold usually more than half the stock market in any developed country. And they told them, if you hold equity that has gone down for 3 months, sell it. Now, you can imagine the effect on the market, the stock market of any country, or several countries at the same time, if you sell all at once, within 3 months, the stuff that's going down. They had a recipe for a systemic crisis, and it took something like 2 or 3 years to push this back to a regulation that would say a year, if you hold equity that's been going down for a year. That was intrusion by bureaucrats who essentially had completely different interests than the people actually in the industry. I hold no brief for the insurance industry, but it was very obvious that there was a large element of what they call in business, when they're not in conferences like this, cover your ass. And honestly, a great deal of regulation is done like that. I don't know how you address this, but I'm throwing this to the room and the co-panelists.
Thank you very much. Antonio, a final thought from you. So much to go at from those questions.
Well, the issue of simplification or bringing reality to some regulation of the European Union is ongoing from forever and ever, basically because, as you were rightly pointed out, at a certain point, what happened is that it was too difficult for business to do business in their member states. They wanted an European regulation. That was the entire idea of the internal market. Now, how do you adjust and make this as much as transparent as possible, or more transparent than it is today? Frankly speaking, I've been involved in a lot of negotiation in the European Union. I never found those type of elements you are mentioning, but maybe I was lucky. I don't want to say anything against that. The Commission has an incredible difficulty in communicating Europe. This is super evident, has been the same, and I think it will remain the same. There is a difficulty of fathoming a message which is the same for 27 member states and can go across for 27 member states in an efficient manner, and there is an incredible shyness in wanting to come into the debates of national politics. I mean, look at Brexit. We did nothing in the UK during the entire debate, nothing at all. On COFE, two things. One is, I must admit I was not too impressed by the result of COFE, but at the same time I was not too surprised, not too impressed in the sense that at the end of the day not many people participated in that conference. I honestly do not think that there was a bias in getting the people to participate. I think a lot of people which were not interested, they were rightly pointing out, they didn't want to participate. So of course, like in many other situations, those who want to say something at the end get the word. What I do disagree is that nothing has been done. I mean, much of the legislative process of the Commission of this year is a result of COFE. The Commission has put forward, I think, 23 legislative proposals, which are the result of the COFE consultation. So it's not that we're not taking seriously. What has not been taken seriously yet is the idea that to implement certain result of COFE, you need to do a treaty at European level. This is not leaving the ground because we all know the difficulties that this has. I stop it here.
Thank you. Rob, a final point from you. I was very struck by the point there, I'm paraphrasing, but that Euroscepticism as a positive, constructive force, skepticism being something important.
Well, yeah, I think what the most important thing is that we don't listen to each other anymore. There is no real debate. On a lot of things, the rise of populism, that can be the problem, but the real problem is that these people are still unheard, and they are becoming more disappointed, and that's why the voice is getting stronger. And it would be very nice if, I'm not talking about left or right, it's about, let's say, progressive or more conservative, but if people start listening to each other, if we have a real debate and stopping giving each other's names. I was very critical on the energy transition, for example. They called me a climate denier. I was 30 years in the energy business. And so I really know what I'm talking about. Still, the people, even from the EPP, called me a climate denier. But that's not the case. I said, if we are doing the transition in this way, we are ruining our economy. And so, for me, it's really a request. Let's have a real debate. And that's so important. That brings me to the other point from that lady behind. Sorry, we introduced yesterday, but I forgot your name. About Nate. Yeah, I will take that also. The economy, it's so important. Nowadays, I see that especially with young people, making money is something evil. But it is necessary. If we want to invest in a better future, we need to earn money. It's not only social, it's also hard-working, because no one wants to do work without paying. You have to pay the rent, you have to buy your food, your mortgage, everything. So, but also companies and also member states, they should have a positive balance. So you need to make money. Europe is not a military power. Europe is an economic power, and it's so important that we keep that position. We have the internal market that's very strong, but what we have done now to our with the Green Deal, I think it really becomes a problem. Fit for 55 cost about 5,000 billion euros, according to scientists, and the result will only be 0.004 degrees less warming up. I'm a simple human being. If I invest money, I want to have a result. And if we invest in things that don't have a result, it's like this, it's the same thing at home. You can spend every euro just one time. If you spend your money on things without a result, you cannot spend it on better education, on military power, on infrastructure, etc. So let's stay an economic superpower in the world, and that's taking care of our economy. Then two short things, the rule of law, of course, the rule of law is very important, but even in my country, the rule of law in the Netherlands is really under pressure. Mr. Mark Rutte is hurting a lot of people. No one talks about it because he is pro-European. If you are, let's say, a conservative government, then you are under pressure. If you fight for the rule of law, then you have to do it in an equal way. And first of all, the Commission should give the right example. They should start with being transparent. There are a lot of things the Commission is not transparent. You cannot point your finger to other people without doing the right thing yourself. My parents always said, improve the world, but start with yourself. So that's a thing, and then there was another question, but let's do that at the lunch.
Let's do that over lunch. And the final 30 seconds to my friend Robert Tyler on behalf of New Direction.
Yeah, so I think I'll try and encapsulate all of the questions into sort of one simple answer, which is a bit of a challenge, but I'll say this. Our approach is probably, if we're looking at EU founding fathers, let's have more Robert Schuman and less Spinelli. Let's go to this idea of a confederal Europe rather than a sort of ever closer union and a centralized power in Brussels. Let's sort of embrace competition. I mean, the answer to this idea of the single market is yes, it's 3 cheers for the single market. You know, it's the greatest thing about the European Union is the idea that we've created the largest trading area on earth. It's the movement of goods, services, and labor. Let's build on the things that are strong. What we mean by less but better is let's get rid of some of the more burdensome regulation. In fact, let's even embrace a bit of the competition. You know, the Hayekian principle of competing states. You know, that drives innovation, that drives growth, and I think you know that's where I'll leave it.
On that invigorating note, can you thank your brilliant panel? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, again. Thank you very much.
I was wondering how I was going to explain it.
But she was our founder in 2005.
So
you stay for lunch, yes?
No, I stay for lunch, but I'm also in the next panel, so I have to stay.
Bring this panel forward the next time. Yeah. Very, very good. Thank you. Okay, great. Could we get everybody to take their places, please? Okay, yes, that would be fine. I'm going to stay here for the moment, Rob. And we've got yourself, Calypso, who's just coming back. Rosa Martinez. Yeah, she's coming. Yeah? Could you go and find her, perhaps? Calypso's disappeared. I know. It's the onset of the conference, no. This is a fascinating panel where all of the panelists have left the room.
Can you hear me?
No, we have one. Oh, we have one. That's progress. Yeah. I think you should adopt the Austrian principle of monopolizing the entire discourse. Now we're getting some progress. Okay, we're getting some panelists. This is progress. Now we just need to wait for our last panelist. Could you try and find Calypso and bring her in?
Can you hear me?
Hello. Hello. We can't start without the panelists, Francesco. Calypso, would you like to take your place at the table? Okay, so we reached the end, or as I prefer to think of it, the climax of this conference with our final plenary, at which I am delighted to introduce as our panelists two distinguished academics, Eric Jones, director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute, and Calypso Nikolaidis, who is a professor at St. Anthony's College in Oxford and a professor also at the School of Transnational Governance of the EUI. And we have two eminent politicians, Rosa Martinez, who was a member of the European Parliament and is on the editorial board of the Green European Journal, and Rob Bruce, who was in our last session, an MEP and vice chair of the European Conservatives and Reformists group. Also, I am delighted to welcome to our discussions Italy's Europe Minister, Raffaele Fitto, who is online. And since I know that you have a very limited time, Minister, I'd like to start by asking you about one area of your responsibilities, which is the Italian projection of the new generation, next generation EU. Your image has disappeared, but I believe that you're still with us in voice. There's been quite a lot of discussion about common fiscal capacity in this conference, and at one extreme the idea that it's just NGEU is just a one-off and to be dispensed with once it's performed its role, and at the other extreme the idea that it could provide a blueprint for a common fiscal capacity going forward, and then lots of other formulas in between. And I just wonder what you yourself, what thoughts you had on where we could take the idea of common fiscal capacity in the future. we seem to have lost not only the image, but also the sound of the minister. I think what we're going to have to do is to move on. What I would like to do is to skip over that question, actually, and ask the panelists if there's anything that's particularly struck them about the conference or about the final conclusions that we've been hearing today. I know that not all of you have been here for the entire conference, but some of you arrived last night, and but nevertheless will have heard those final conclusions. Eric, perhaps I could start with you at the end, and then we move down the table.
Well, super. Thanks, John. And thanks, everybody, for allowing me to come and speak to you at the end of the conference. I'm going to just give you a couple of thoughts about what I've heard from the reporting out of the groups and also from the last panel, because although some of you might not have been here for the last panel, I think it was important and interesting food for thought. The recommendations that came out of the groups were actually really interesting because we had 4 different problem areas and they actually identified 4 different domains of activity. So if you were to talk to the group that was dealing with democracy, they would say it's all about participation, and they were looking for different ways to re-engineer. There's Minister Fito. Do you want me to keep going?
Minister has reappeared. Minister, can you
hear me?
Excellent. Yes, we can
hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you very well. But now you've disappeared again. I think you better resume, Eric. Sorry.
It's okay. I'm used to teaching via Zoom, so I'm good at this whole technological failure thing. If you were to ask the democracy group, what they would say is that there are institutional fixes in order to improve participation, and that through participation, at the end of the day, we're going to get some kind of a better Europe and a better process wrapped around it. If you were to talk to the climate action group, though, it's not really about participation, it's about communication, it's about understanding. And so there were a lot of efforts that were made in order to communicate both the incentives that are necessary in order to achieve the kind of investments in technological transformation that's underway, and the justification for those incentives and the distribution of costs and burdens that would represent. And so we have a more participatory Europe and a more communicative Europe evolving at the same time. If you were to ask the macroeconomic governance group, they would say it's about more coordination. They'd probably say that about the presentation of what the group's findings. But if you were to listen to what they talked about in the context of the group's findings, the emphasis was less on institution building and more about making the institutions work together more effectively. And then if you go to the digital group is all about more or better regulation, trying to understand how it is that we're supposed to control the things that we see around us and whether we even have that capacity to control. So when you add those things together, the participation, the communication, the coordination, and the regulation, you get a sense that in order to tackle these 4 different domains, we actually have to reinvent governance in many respects. Now, the focus of attention is on Europe, but I think the thing that became so interesting in the panel that just took place is the extent to which Europe is a distraction from governance problems that exist on every level of aggregation. Because I can't think of a single level of government that wouldn't benefit from better participation, better communication, better coordination, and better regulation. And in fact, if you were to have this conference and say, how do we improve governance rather than how do we improve Europe, I think most of us would be talking about what's going on at the national level and not at the European level per se. Because the biggest challenges that we face right now in salvaging Western liberal democracy are challenges associated with national level governance, of which Europe should be part of the solution and not part of the problem. But I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Eric, thank you very much indeed. I noticed, in fact, that during part of what you were saying, there was some nodding coming from Rob Roos here. Perhaps I could ask you next what it is that has struck you most about the conference, and perhaps it was just what Eric has been saying.
Oh, wow. Yes, well, it's interesting. Of course, we want better communication, better democracy, better digital. But that's theory. The practice is that people don't understand it anymore. And if it's always, we have to communicate it better. But that's not the case. It's just what people feel every day when they have to do the shopping, when they have to pay the bill. So the theory and the daily practice, that is where it goes wrong. We can make all kinds of ideological ideas, and but if, for example, democracy, what I see is that democracy is moving away from people. It's, for example, the climate law. It was adopted. It's there for till 2050. And, well, the people go out for a vote in the member states for, let's say, the national parliament, but where are they voting for? Because it's decided in Brussels, and it's never going away. Once it is decided in Brussels, and that's what we heard, that's also what was said in the last panel, that is where national parliaments use it as an excuse for it has to be done by Brussels. We don't like it, but it has to be done. So our national parliaments have become an executive body of Brussels. But people cannot really make a choice. There is only an illusion of a choice. I use always the example when I go to say to my son, we go out for dinner tonight, you can choose, do you want a burger, do you want a pizza? And then he said, I want a burger. And in the end, I said, did you have the feeling that you had a choice? Yes, I could choose between a pizza and a burger. I said, no, I give you only two options, and maybe they are two bad options. But it's not a real choice. And democracy is about the power of the people. That should it be. So if we come up with all kinds of better, let's talk to the people. Let's talk to the small businesses. And not only on a high level, but down to earth. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And you used the climate policy as an example for that. So I'm going to next go to Rosa Martinez to say, do you think that there has been a democratic deficit in the formulation of the Europe's policy towards climate change? And are there things within this conference that have struck you particularly, either on that issue or others?
I could say that climate change law or climate policy is not an exception on how policies are shaped at European level. So if our diagnosis is that's lacking democracy, it's going to lack in any of the topics or any of the areas that Europe is legislating. What I have been stuck me, if you allow me, is about the topics, because the title of the conference is about 21st century, but main of the topics is old and unresolved problems of question of Europe. Democracy, governance, integration. So it's like we are getting around the same topics with different elements, different dimensions as the years are passing. Of course, we have new topics that have shaped the last 2 years' policies and politics, Ukraine, and the role of Europe in the NATO, the recovery plan, and also energy. In my opinion, the only two very new topics we have addressed is artificial intelligence and biodiversity. That's where I found the novelty. Other thing that stuck me is that I haven't found very different ideological difference between the three groups or political families we are here.
We are not confronting models. We are only defining different level of intensity. How much regulation, a bit or more fiscal coherence, but there are not two different models of Europe. And I think that's a problem, because it's lacking a strategy view. We don't have a new European project. In my opinion, this term, this European Commission, has been more present than ever in the media. Politics and policies have been trying to address the right challenge and the right problems, but still, Europe is not doing well. We are being outside of the world. So we are not making any difference, and we are still turning around the same topics about democracy, governance, integration. But do we have a project for Europe? That would be my question.
Well, let me bounce that question straight on to Kalypso Niklaidis. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, John, you were telling me earlier that, yes, you would ask her, what do we get from this conference? And I agree with most of what my colleagues said. I would say there's three things that I'm walking away with. First of all, this is a precious space because it's bubble bashing. You know, we do reflect in this room a number of really relevant cleavages, real differences, but also listen to each other, as you were saying, Rob. And not paper over these differences, but if we can get somewhere in it, we are a good test case. And let me pick three differences. Generational, and clearly there was, and it's wonderful to have our students here, and they don't have the same emphasis often, and they also present beautifully. But their relation to time tends to be different, and they come back to issues of digital and issues of anchoring and education, all of that. But then there is the ideological, which was really interesting because, of course, we're pretty, there's, you know, left, right, yeah, in the conference. And we heard the macroeconomic group. I mean, they kind of made their disagreement very explicit in front of all of us. You know, laver son linge sale en famille, we say in French. That was really cool because we need agonistic politics. And here, the big debate of the 21st century, to me, is indeed public versus private, market versus state, or is the market a means to an end or an end in itself? I mean, all these big debates. But we also understand that we have to find some sort of the magic balance between market incentives, in whichever field, and regulation bans that are decided collectively. But the third cleavage that is fascinating to me is obviously this cleavage but it's not pro-anti-EU. It's a different kind of cleavage. And the previous panel with Anne-Elisabeth, Rob, and Antonio, and people in the room made explicit stuff that were going on before in the conference and elsewhere. But let me say that my own personal take on that conversation has to do with the idea that the median European is actually neither Eurosceptic nor Europhile. They, you know, if you look at the polls, they approve more Europe. They see pandemic, they see Ukraine more. Huge numbers want more Europe, but also more decentralized Europe, more stuff decided through local engineering. So let's say they're integrationists in substance and sovereignist in methods. That's what I read, just to highly simplify, you know, your median Europeans with lots and lots of variation. And if that's the case, then the EU should be all about, yeah, doing more things better, etc. But better is about democratic anchoring, taking stuff all the way down. And that brings me very quickly to this. My second point is that we are talking about crisis. We know that crisis can be horizon expanding or horizon shrinking. You know, it can open to political vistas and imagination, or it can shrink the space because we're constrained here and there. And I think part of what we're doing is asking, under what conditions can it be horizon expanding? And that condition brings me to my third point, John. And my third point, you know, is the underlying question is, well, the condition to me is indeed very simple. It's democratic authoring. It's to write everybody as part of the story. I write myself in the story. That's what democracy is. And I think Europe could be, you know, what I call citizen power Europe, could be an example of doing that and harnessing collective intelligence. But, and here's the really important but, and I want to come back to, in closing, to what I've heard. Democracy is about engineering difficult conversation, really difficult conversation. So to bring people in a room, you know, under coffee and say, what are the nice things you want Europe to do? That's super boring. When we want participation of citizens, it's because, you know, they're really, really hard value-based issues to decide, like abortion in Ireland. Or they're really, really difficult distributive implication of what we decide. Short-term, long-term, between classes, who pays for what, end of the month, end of the year, end of the world, and all of that. So, I mean, if I look at the topics that we discussed together in the last 3 days, coming back a bit with to Eric's kind of list, we need to translate each of them in what were the difficult, really difficult conversation. And in fact, that's where I think probably, Eric, we might slightly disagree, because you read one conclusion from the first group, or from any group, and I read cleavages, you know, on democratic institutions. I mean, there are those who are much more interested in traditional electoral politics and those who are more interested in innovative democratic practices. Doesn't mean one or the other, but that's a real tension. Similarly, you know, when we talk European institutions, there are those who think more efficiency, big states, and those like me who are obsessed with the power of smaller states. But that's quite a difference, and it has different implications. Sustainable finance, you know, Mira brilliantly, you know, summarized it for us, but, you know, clearly you can emphasize market mechanism or you can emphasize bans and regulation. And when we're in a rush, aren't we moving towards the second? Even if we are not that comfortable with it. I loved, thirdly, the panel on COP15 versus COP27. Brilliant framing, which we never hear. We were commenting, I think it was with Peter, about that at STG. You know, it's always in different worlds. But those trade-offs and those who argue, no, it's not a lovely marriage between the biodiversity and climate. They're real tensions. How you plant a forest. These are really important tensions. And if you're a farmer somewhere, you've got to confront these tensions. You become schizophrenic. Am I biodiversity woman or am I a climate change person? Help, help. But these are real tensions. If you don't talk about tensions, you don't resolve the tension. Macroeconomics was, I said it before, libertarian versus interventionist, you know, good old division, but really underlying this, who's supposed to deliver European public goods or more or less European, more or less club goods, etc. Which level should do that? Maybe probably all levels, but how, with what emphasis? These are very big differences. Europe, our geopolitical panel. Europe peace, yeah, we were reminded, Europe peace, but we are now woo-woo, military power. Is that the right? That's a real fundamental difference. AI, you know, control, yeah, it's really cool what we're trying to do, controlling our data in Europe, wow, brilliant. You know, we don't have the GAFAs, but we'll attract the data. But what does that do to our global competitiveness? That is a real big issue, that the Brits, my dear, you know, other country, you know, ask in a really cogent way. And finally, the recovery facility, Next Gen Fund, there is a tension here between expediency and democratic control all the way down. So what I'm trying to say is that what's really, really interesting in our conversation before trying to get to an agreement is to highlight the trade-offs, the tension, the difficulties, because that's what democracy is about. So that would be my lesson from what I've heard.
Thank you very much indeed, Calypso. Okay, I'd like to move the discussion on to, first of all, I'd like to talk about we're approaching the elections next year, and we have two politicians here to talk about that. There's been a lot of discussion about what might happen on the right, Rob, whether there have been rumors of maybe the ECR linking up with the PP, et cetera, et cetera. How do you see that panning out on the right?
I will start with an obvious cliche that still needs to be mentioned. No one here has a crystal ball. The dynamics of the European election first and foremost depend on national dynamics. We are all Europeans, but in the first place, we are citizens of our national states. Political discussions take place there. Almost all citizens are first and foremost moved by issues at play in a national context. It's important to understand this, especially to those who are at risk of being sucked into the Brussels bubble. That said, it's also true that we can discern certain trends which manifest themselves everywhere in Europe. High inflation affects almost everyone. Rising energy prices affects almost everyone. A lack of affordable housing affects many people. And these problems are directly connected to the EU decisions. Inflation is connected to the monetary policies of the European Central Bank. Rising energy prices are connected to the Green Deal, more specifically to the fact that technological neutrality is still not enshrined within that Green Deal, and that so-called renewables get special privileges over nuclear power without any justification. And the lack of affordable housing is directly connected to the EU's immense failure to protect the external borders adequately. The EU hasn't learned its lessons in 2015. The amount of people in my country, the Netherlands, which already has the highest population density of Europe, has increased from 15 million to 80 million people in the last 30 years. And this number is growing faster and faster. There is a year-on-year record. It's not any different in many other countries. So let me tell you, the EU is about to find out how voters think about that. So yes, all trends point towards a shift in favor of outsider parties, in shift of the favor of the challenger parties, in shift of the favor of the parties that want a real change. The EPP and certain parts of Renew have noticed too. They are starting to push back against some of the more radical elements of the Commission's agenda, such as the disastrous nature restoration law, which would impose a permanent economic lockdown in the Netherlands and ruin many other member states. And it's my hope that this sudden ideological turn represents a sincere turn towards the wishes of the people, that it's representing something lasting, that it means common sense is truly coming back, and that it's something we can build on during the next term. So I hope that, it's my hope that after the next elections, forces of the right will finally start working together, all in the interest of the people, less ideology, more realistic policy, because it will make everyone's lives better, especially in the long term for our children. And
Can I interpret that as an endorsement for an alliance between the two groups? He nodded. Rob said that all the indications are of a trend towards outsider groups. Now, I don't know whether Rosa would consider the Greens to be an outsider group, but how do you view the prospects for 2024 at the polls?
Yeah, in fact, it's, we are worried because it can be really a turning point for the European Green Deal. We have been, how conservatives have turned down the last weeks with all the environmental package. And of course, in the middle of the ecological crisis, we are living not only climate crisis, that could be, in my opinion, a failure for Europe. Stop leading what they have been leading and working for this year. Not only the economical, industrial, and innovation transformation that the Green Deal means, but also all the decarbonization process and leading the climate change. If Europe steps out and fails for advocating for ambitious climate policy, I don't think anyone else in the world would do it. And I was asking in my previous intervention, what will be a European project? What's the European role in the world? What do we want to do? What do we want to be regarding China or States? What are our relationship with Africa and Latin America? So we have two options in the last Commission term. Keep looking at ourselves in a changing world, or really have a European project that can lead somehow or have a role in the world. And from the Greens, we have seen here fear relating climate and environmental policies, but I think there is much more at stake in the next elections. And once and again, the main will be challenge or how to engage with citizens in these elections, that they understand there are too many at stake. Security, autonomy, social policies, climate policy, there are too many.
This is the theme that comes up again and again, isn't it? How to engage with the citizens. This has been a recurrent theme right the way through today, and indeed I would say throughout the conference. I'm not going to put the political questions, the party political questions, to our two academic panelists, but what I would like to ask them, starting with Eric, is what you would like to see in this conference next year, because we're looking ahead to Siena 2024, and perhaps you give us an idea of where you'd like to see the focus of the next conference.
Well, John, thanks. I love the agenda setting idea. I'm going to riff off of something that was said in the context of the climate presentation. And the point that was made was, we also have to face the challenge of persuading the rest of the world that what Europe is doing is not protectionist, right? Well, good luck with that. Because the United States has failed signally to persuade the rest of the world that what it's doing with the IRA is not protectionist. And Europe is going to fail signally in persuading the rest of the world that what it's doing with CBAM is not protectionist. And yet, and this gets back to the point that Rob made, and yet we need sustained climate action, and this is the point that Rosa made, we need sustained global leadership if we're going to tackle this hugely important agenda. Now, you guys, I think, really stepped on the message when you said, the urgency for mitigation action is clear, right? And the problem is, it has been clear since COP15. And we have not done the mitigation action that we need to do. And so the amount of carbon that we have in the atmosphere right now thermodynamically ensures that we will blow through 1.5 and head very close to 2. And if we exceed 2, we're not going to be worrying just about mitigation. We're going to be worrying about adaptation. So I think the next year's conference is going to have to talk about how we're going to fund adaptation to a climate change that is inevitable, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world. Because, and the second agenda that we're going to face is if we do not fund adaptation to climate change in the Middle East and in sub-Saharan Africa, we are going to have to deal with a migration problem that will make 2015 look like somebody brought a school trip to Europe and not the thing that we're really going to have to deal with. And so I think we have to deal with that. Now, while we're doing that, the third thing that should be on the agenda is going to have to be how we stabilize Europe's eastern frontier. And the eastern frontier of Europe starts at the easternmost border of Ukraine. And so how are we going to deal with this complex security dilemma? I know it would be great if we didn't have to worry about these security issues and we could pretend that Europe could just be an economic superpower. But the fact of the matter is, the world doesn't want things to be that way. And then the fourth item on the agenda, because we have 4 working groups, is going to be how we deal with a world that China wants to engineer according to very different rules of the game. And China's rules of the game are ones that confront Europe with an existential challenge. Because Europe is a market, open, integrated global economy, and China is pushing in the opposite direction. And so, unfortunately, is the United States.
Super, thank you, Eric. Very comprehensive. And Calypso, your chance to set the agenda for the second major event in Europe in 2024. Then we're going to throw it open to the floor.
Being a Democrat, I am not going to take this as my chance to set the agenda, because I think we need to kind of do this in a crowdsourced democratic way. Let me just say one thing, John, that when you said, well, I'm now turning to the academics, so I won't ask the political question, But we academics, first of all, we're citizens, and we have all sorts of political beliefs. But probably more importantly, academia is not about some sort of impartial neutrality. Yes, we analyze the world, but if you're someone like me, I'm a critical theorist, I'm a critical IR theorist, and of course, everything I do in academia ultimately has, while it's analysis, yes, but with a normative benchmark, with a transformative agenda. And I don't hide this from my students, so I shouldn't hide it here. So first of all, we do have political opinions, and we are political. But secondly, to your question, the timing of next year, there is a really big issue for Francesco, which is going to be, are we going to meet before or after the European elections? Just after. We meet after the elections. So we will have a landscape. Not only that, we will have a sense. We won't have a new European Commission, but we will have an occasion to be one of the voices that helps set the agenda for the next Commission. And of course, this is hyper-conditional on what the EP will look like. Will we know who's the next head of the Commission at that point? Not clear. Maybe Ursula will come back. So first of all, we need to be very attuned to the context that we're going to find next year. Secondly, indeed, let's have, Eric, your list, all of the dilemma that we will face, but including Rosa's. Europe as a laboratory for the world, what does that mean? All of these issues will be in front of us. And I think hopefully we can have a method that is much more controversial. This House believes, as we do in Oxford. But my own agenda, if you ask me what I would prefer, and I won't surprise you, is that we are launching, we at the EUI, but with a whole bunch of friends and colleagues, what we are calling the Democratic Odyssey. And the Democratic Odyssey is both a campaign, a design, and an implementation of what a real citizen assembly in the EU could look like, based and fed by an ecosystem of citizens' assemblies around Europe. A citizen assembly that would meet in different places, that would be empowered. There's much to say about this. It's a grand project, and we're launching it now because in September 24, in fact, just after our meeting, we will have that assembly in Athens, and we are inviting anyone and everyone who is interested to be part of the flotilla that accompanies this adventure. Because we want not to just be academics who have blueprints, but actually to do it and get our boots dirty. So I am hoping that since we will be just before this moment, that in this very room, as a group of friends who have met over the years, you will be able, and we will be able to feed this process, and it will be a kind of a last occasion to do it before the big meeting. But of course, the word Odyssey indicates that this is a long-term journey. So I didn't want to lose the opportunity to put this on the agenda too, John.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Calypso. You mentioned crowdsourcing as a virtue. That gives me a perfect springboard to open it up to discussion by the full plenary. Comments, questions, criticisms, rejections. Anyone? And we need a microphone. We need a microphone. We have a brave soul here in the third row of. No, we've got the lollipop. We've got the gelato.
Hello, hello, hello. Yes. Well, it's a reflection on. Is this working? We watched who were to leave the chat and the wine in the main portico and join us for the film. That I made 6 years ago, on the migrant crisis and on the security crisis of the EU. And I had not watched it in a very long time, and I had literally chills on my spine. And then the conversation that we had with the friends who stayed over, we were kind of gobsmacked by how much of the film of what the European Union was doing in 2016 was still very relevant, and still nothing had been done, and there were no advancement, no progress, and actually no taking stock of what we knew back then. So I was thinking, how can we do something better about it? Because, I mean, it has been mentioned that we meet each other here every time, every year, and we repeat the same things, and we go in circle and circle and circle. So my suggestion would be that maybe for next edition, we really try to find a way, I don't know, I'm just thinking aloud here, to be tougher on us and on the European Union, and make an accountability list of all the mistakes, of all the catastrophic mistakes that have been done along the past 10 years, and really leave a track record of all the things that for future generation, and also for students to, you know, it has been often said that journalism is the first draft of history. And as journalists, sometimes we see things happening and then are completely kind of wiped away because they're too recent and there is no track record. So maybe just establish that we will make a sin list, an accountability list of all the things that the European Union was supposed to be doing, it has not done, and who should be accountable for it. Just a list to give a sense that it's not only a yearly talk shop, but it leaves some kind of chronicle of what we were saying and trying to do.
That could actually would sort of resist the idea of being tougher on vision, because we are already dead. So I will not flat.
Now, anyone, a hand has been raised here.
Since Francesco was anticipating that probably we have to postpone, let's say, the conference, but given that we have to check schedule Pontignano first of all, and then September is a very dense month, so we have to talk about that. But if the idea is to postpone, to have, let's say, 1 month after the election, in order to see what's going on with the governance of the European Union, maybe we can prepare a sort of data room. I don't want to insist, I think that we have, I agree with Annalisa, lots of different topics, and probably we have to focus on specific policy-related topic. But if we have 1 month after the election, maybe on the or a couple, yes, sure. Maybe to prepare sort of a data room with different sources for participation and perception about that. It could be a nice thing. Of course, this has been working before, but maybe we can organize some labs with the students, with the guys at the UI, and you know, maybe we can have something, you know, to provide some follow-up about the topic of democracy and participation.
Gentleman back there, and then Kurt.
Thank you. I would make a point about the adaptation that was raised there. I couldn't agree more. We're actually at 1.2 degrees, so the 1.5 degrees, it's there. But my point is that looking at the adaptation, it's not just an issue of Europe, because the developing world will be hidden harder from climate change, both because of the structural production, mainly agriculture, because of the limited capacity to adapt. And a lack of adaptation of the developing world will generate probably waves of climate-induced migration and other issues that are going to hit Europe. So I think I fully agree with adaptation, and I think that adaptation should be expanded not just to Europe, but what Europe can do in order to promote adaptation in the rest of the world.
The obvious person to answer that is Rosa. Let me just have a comment from Rosa on that, perhaps, first, before we go on to take a question from Kurt.
Yeah, I agree with you that adaptation is key policy and should be a priority. But we cannot forget about mitigation. I mean, it's sometimes, no, but I say that because sometimes we trust too much in our technical capacity, in our financial capacity to recover and to pay what has been destroyed by climate impacts. That has a limit, and it's not efficient. And there are some of the impacts that you cannot buy or you cannot pay for in 10, 15 years. So, of course, adaptation should be a priority for Europe, especially the Mediterranean area, that could be the member state more hit by. And of course, should help other countries to adapt. And that has been in the discussion in the last COP. How do we help, or how do you support these people who are supporting our climate impacts that are not responsible for? So totally agree, but adaptation, mitigation need to go hand by hand.
With apologies to Kurt, I noticed that Rob would like to jump in on this, and then Calypso.
Yeah. This is very interesting. Does anyone has any idea if we achieve the climate goals of the European Union? Has anyone of you any idea what the effect will be on the global temperature? No, on the temperature. Just on the temperature. What? Yeah, okay, but no, but I want to come to your point. I think adoption of this measure is so important, because if we meet the temperature of all the climate goals and we spend all the thousands of billions of euro, the effect will be 0.04 degrees less warming up. And that's true. That this is IPCC.
Francesco, could we have the microphone?
I want to make my point. Then you can react. What's your number? Between 0.2 and 0.06.
You ask for the impact on Celsius degrees,
yes.
0.4. And you might say, well, 0.4 is not much, but remember, we increased the temperature by 1 degree from the beginning of the industrial revolution up to now. And this is the result of 6% translated into the impact of the IPCC and OECD scenarios.
But what I want to say is the impact is very small, and we spent all this money, and that's what.
It's not small, because it increased by 1 degree in 2 centuries.
Okay, but let me make my point now, please.
It's 0.4, just to understand, it's 0.4.
0.04.
0.04.
400 of a degrees. IPCC.
0.04.
He said 0.04, and
yes.
that's why I reacted.
Yes. Well, okay. I can show you the report. Okay, that's good. But the thing is, I think we should go for adoption. It's very important. I come from the Netherlands. We create our own country. We know how to protect against water. But the thing is, I come back to what Rose and Eric said. We have to show the world and Africa about all we can do. But what I miss is that we have to work for the people in Europe. The people in Europe, those are the ones who we, as an elected member of the European Parliament, I have to serve those people. I'm not here to take care of the whole world. And if you want to, the question that you ask, how do we connect to the people? Start listening to the people and not pushing all these regulations. We have to show the world and using fear to convince people. Let's connect to the people by being there for them and not only telling them what to do and to pay the price for that. That's what my message is.
Calypso, you wanted to say something on this.
You know, in opening, I argued that we should have the difficult conversation democratically about trade-offs. So, I mean, Rosa,
I feel I know you're right that we need both, but we can't, there are trade-offs. At Sharm el-Sheikh, in the last COP, we saw that there's going to be a fund, and it's so hard to extract it from the global north. But the question, or adaptation. Now, of course, it goes to both, but there's a bit of a zero sum here in efforts. Not always, but if we don't recognize trade-offs and that the debates need to be domestically, but also globally, democratically anchored, then, the conversation is not super useful. But I want to also ask Rob, then, we hear you, that you say we ask the people, but we also heard you earlier, and I wanted to push you on this nature restoration law. Yes. Now, if you ask me, this nature restoration law that the EU is now going to probably adopt very soon is pretty good. It tries to take care of pollination. 1/3 of bee species is disappearing as we speak. Butterflies, same thing, etc. Habitat. Now, the habitats, natural habitats in Europe, they benefit the people. This is pretty important stuff that when you have polling, you see that people pretty much support this kind of thing. So although, I agree with your emphasis on democracy and asking the people, I am wondering how that squares with your very negative statement about the nature restoration law in the spirit of really getting to substantive issues, why we agree and why we disagree.
Yeah, I'm happy to react on that. We, in the Netherlands, you know all the situation about the farmers. I think you heard of that. The Netherlands, we have this Nature 2000 areas. Our country will become a complete Nature 2000 area. There's nothing that can be done anymore. We cannot build houses anymore at this moment because of nitrogen, and we get rid of 3,000 farmers, 50% of the cattle. If this law is adopted, we cannot do anything anymore. And the strange thing is we have to go back 70 years. That is the point what we have to achieve. But no one knows what this reform point is. We don't have any, 70 years back, but no one knows what that is. It was just after the war. So we cannot explain that. And and it's also hypocrite because the European Commission is coming up with this nature restoration law. In the meantime, we burn complete forests to save the planet. We call it biomass. What is doing that with biodiversity? We installing 450 gigawatt of installed power with wind turbines on sea. Sea is also nature. And what is doing, so it's, and I'm advocating for 4 years now in the European Parliament to implement nuclear power because of the high energy density, and they still refuse it to do. So if you want to save nature, if you want to save land space, if you want to give nature back to all kinds of species, you have to save land space, and you can only do that with nuclear power, and they still want to refuse this. So if you really believe this is a problem, and I'm very in favor of saving nature. I love nature, really. Adopt nuclear power. It's the only way to go.
I'm going to cut in there because Kurt de Boeuf has been extremely
on the record to say,
patient, and I think we're
power,
going to give over the floor to Kurt.
Thank you very much. I would like to make two small points. First of all, I mean, I heard a lot of times using the word people. I think the people as such do not exist in a way. I mean, the people are as divided as we are on every subject. So the second thing is I agree with you, Annalisa, that we maybe should be tougher on the EU and make a list. But on the other hand, maybe we should also be fairer towards what the EU actually has brought. And I think that we focus, and that's typically in politics, you know, I've been in politics for a long time. One tends to remember what goes wrong and doesn't see what has gone well. And I think that part, which is perhaps much bigger than we imagine, should also, I think, look what has gone well and why did it go well? And maybe we can learn from these good points in order to make less good points or on which we have to be tough.
Yeah, I just
Jonathan.
wanted to contribute to the agenda setting process for future conference. And here, I think that one issue which might be quite strategic is the future of the EU budget. So that brings together quite a number of issues. There are also governance issues. I mean, there's a discussion about how to use the budget to fund more public goods, both at the European level, but also I like the way Marco Butti uses the concept of distributed public goods, that is, goods, activities that are funded by the EU but take place at the national level. And then, of course, that raises the question of how do you govern and manage the relationship between the EU institutions and the member states, and indeed other stakeholders who are historically involved in what have been the cohesion fund. So I think, you know, if you want to do something on which brings together the economic, the social, and the governance dimensions, then focusing on where are we going with the reform of the EU budget, the multi-annual financial framework might be a good and more focused topic.
Thanks. Are there other questions?
Yes, there's a hand raised here, and I think that's going to be our last question because I know that you want time to wrap up at the end with Alexandra, and I know also that people want to be out of here by 1 o'clock because they'll be getting hungry by then. Please.
Just a couple of comments. One is on the issue of mitigation versus adaptation. My view is that acting on mitigation is one choice, is our choice. Acting on adaptation may be a choice, but we will be forced to adapt. So it's not our choice. If we have to adapt, we will adapt. We don't have to choose whether we will adapt or not. We may choose the methods, but we are going to be forced to adapt to the change. But we can choose to mitigate. The second is on whether we should be passing laws and regulations limiting emissions. I don't want to get myself into the discussion whether it's 4/10 or 400ths of a degree. But on the other way, even if our behavior will change the global temperature of only 400ths of degree, what is the other option? To act like this or even increase the emissions and change the weather temperature by 400ths of degrees more? So I believe that in choosing to do whatever we can do to decrease emissions and mitigate global change, you know, there is a sort of ethical commitment or a commitment for ethical reasons. Even if our contribution to the overall change is tiny, we should still act in that direction for ethical reasons.
Thank you very much. No more questions. This has, unfortunately, because of the intermittent appearances of Minister Fito, somewhat been Hamlet without the prince, or maybe Hamlet but with Banquo. But nevertheless, a very stimulating and interesting conversation. I'm now going to hand over to Alexandra Borchardt and to Francesco Grillo to wrap up not only this debate, but the entire conference with the annotation, if I may say, that I noticed that climate change came back again and again during this discussion as well, and that the Vision has a second conference this year in the Dolomites on the issue dedicated exclusively to the issue of climate change, and some of you, no doubt, will be joining us there. Thank you very much.
we will be very quick, no?
Yeah.
Okay, because we have lunch. Yes, we will have a second conference. It is a global conference. This is meant to be European, although we had Paul from Australia and many people, many friends from UK. It is sort of not part of the European Union any longer. It will be on global governance of climate change. And it will be very, very, very interesting. One of the things that we will probably do is also to sort of reframe the problem, Simone, because it's very clear here. And what else? As far as climate change, by the way, this weekend was less warm than last weekend in Pontignano last year. It was in May. So climate change is not a linear trajectory, by the way. We took a lot of notes. I hope that Clara, Georgia, Margherita did the same, and you people from the University of Siena and our friends at the UI, so we will try to frame a more efficient agenda. It is not really easy to do problem solving. There is one thing that I want to probably refer. It was in Pontignano, actually, the other Pontignano, the smaller Pontignano. There is another event in Pontignano that is an event organized by the UK Embassy. And it's Italy-UK sort of meeting. It's a meeting between the two governments, Siena. And I sort of asked Giuliano, who has been one of the masterminds of European integration up to a few years ago. And I asked you make so-called the constitutional, the Lisbon complex, so that people cannot understand. So it was and he, by the way, he then authorized me to write this thing into a book of mine, because and by the way, he added, this was our approach to the construction of Europe, because we as a generation, including also most likely Mario Monti, Mario Draghi, Romano Prodi, up to a point, we were sort of convinced that it should have been built that way, sort of top-down. And he acknowledged that the Europe of the future, will have to be built through a different method by a completely different generation. This generation probably is not even us, it's the students, it's you, but certainly this is something that I would insist. Europe will need to solve the communication problem that Antonio was talking about, that it's not just about investing more in communication or find some communication guru, no? It's really about changing your semantics and having the will, the political will to be understood. Because when you are understood, you are also challenged. And this very much also applies to many of the big political issues that we are trying to sort of advance. Going back for a second, Jonathan, to the question of a Stability and Growth Pact. I mean, you need a PhD to understand the Stability and Growth Pact that we had until 2020. It was really complicated. That's something that, it's probably our basic belief we need to change. We need to use regulation. We need to use policies so that we can use the energy of citizens. I totally agree with you, Kurt, when we talk about people, it's a little bit generic, but we need to use the energy of the companies, of the people, of the NGOs to make our regulation more implementable. Because democracy is not just a question of values. We are not just democratic because it is nice to be democratic, because it is a moral obligation. It is a moral obligation. But democracy is also efficient. It's a way to build decisions that are more shared. If they are more shared, they are much easier to be implemented. At least this was in the view of the inventors of liberal democracy in 1689 in Westminster. Alexander.
Yes, first of all, I'd really like to thank you, and I really think it's super that so many of you really stayed in here until the closing panel on a Saturday. I thoroughly enjoyed the level of controversy we had this morning. I hope you did too, because I think this is what it's really all about. I think what Calypso said was entirely right. Like, we need to burst the bubbles. We're way too much in our own bubble. We need intellectual diversity, so many things that were a topic today, and we need a competition. We need a competition of ideas, and it was talked about today about national competition. I would go even further and say we need competition of localities much more than the national competitions, because there are so many solutions being tested everywhere in Europe, and this is not very often, not on the nation state level, but even on lower levels. But what I really find is also extremely important is that we really have to define our values. So what is the stuff that and that was mentioned earlier, the big story, the peace story? What's the stuff that's the glue that keeps us together? And I asked Barbara yesterday, Barbara Kohn who left already, because she was very critical, and then I said, what do you think we do really well as Europeans? And she said diversity. And I think this is actually one of our major strengths, that we are so diverse. We actually have that competition in us, but that only works when you have a defining common goal. And that would be my last point. I also think, and this is something that Kurt just raised, we need to sort of celebrate more. I know that from change management, that you have to define where your goal is, you have to test, you have to experiment, and on the way, you have to sort of celebrate the success stories. And I think that is a major challenge, because many people in Europe don't even know what the success stories of Europe are, and in the debates there came up so many interesting things and facets that people just don't know about, what is really the stuff that they can appreciate about Europe. So more competition, but also a bigger debate on what is the stuff that unifies us, holds us together, and where are we headed as Europe. Thank you so much.
Okay, this is not just a conference, it's a living process. So we will try to solve the problem of the problem-solving group number 3, the fiscal. And we will have many other outputs in terms of ideas, paper, proposal. It's not just about having the ideas and proposal. With some of these ideas and proposal, we will also follow up. We will do the advocacy and the quote-unquote lobbying to make at least one or two of these many proposals that we generated to become real. The dates of the next conference are still to be checked with the administration, but they may be either the 14th of September, as 14, 15, and 16, or the 21st, 22nd, 23rd of September. They both September. So with a new European Parliament, most likely with still no commission, but it's with a very good landscape to try to influence the agenda. So thank you very much.